Welcome everyone to the 2021 NEMSIS Annual Bootcamp. We are so grateful for you to be here with us and spend some time this morning. Everyone in this group is either a state data person or is here by express invitation by a state to represent them. So we've got a little bit of variety, but everybody who's here is invited and welcome, and you're in the right place. If you're thinking EMS data, you're in the right place. We want you to feel comfortable in asking questions, in talking, giving us that feedback of what's working for you, what's not working for you. Share your strengths and your best practices and share your struggles. You know, as we go through our agenda of tools and resources and processes to implement NEMSIS version 3.5, it is truly valuable to us to hear from you what's good, what's bad, where we need to add resources and add support. What do we need to consider for the next time we do this? Things like that are truly beneficial to us to understand what the impact to the states truly is in implementing a new version. So we invite you to ask questions, unmute yourself, use the chat. We anticipate that some of the topics will have a lot more discussion than others. And if we run into the situation where there are just too many questions, please put them in the chat. We capture the chat and we review them, and we'll get back to you. It'll help us also identify where we have those issues or topics that are going to need additional discussion and clarification. So please feel free to do that. We really appreciate you taking your time, being with us. This will be recorded. We've got lots of resources for you. We will share those as links and also show you where those are available on our website. We'll share email addresses and everything that you need to connect with us with your questions, comments, and concerns. All right, we're gonna just jump right in if everyone's ready to go. Clay's gonna start us off this morning, just really talking about the benefits of why we're doing 3.5, and the best person to talk about that is Clay.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Julianne?
Yep, you sound great.
Yeah, thank you. Hey folks, I had a chance just to run down the list real quickly of folks that are joining this call. Wow, just a lot of really good friends that have contributed so much to NEMSIS. This is such a unique federal program in that it's really volunteer. And I see so many people on this call that when we start talking about version 3, their signatures on it, right? They spend hours with us trying to revise the 3.4 standard and make 3.5 as valuable as possible. So, wow, I'll begin with a thank you. And you'll note if you run down through the list, you'll see that Dr. Kramer or Chaney are both on the call from the Office of EMS, mostly just listening in. We're so interested in determining how best we can serve you under the really volunteer work that you do with this program. And please feel like both Dr. Kramer and Eric are working very hard to increase the resources that are associated with NEMSIS. So we just continue to do great work, and the more we do great work, the more our efforts are being recognized. I'm gonna be really quick. I want to just reiterate real quickly what Julianne said. We're going to go through real quickly the changes that are associated with version 3. This bootcamp is all about moving to version 3.5. So we're going to be talking about these things, and we're about to embark on providing you with some multimedia products to help you transition your state to version 3.5. And when you're going through this, if you see something where you say, Clay or Julianne, I need some way to communicate that to my providers, or I need some way to communicate that to my director, please speak up, please put it in the chat, because that will improve those products that we're beginning to work on. This is our last chance, with vendors not present, for us to talk about what we need, what you need to transition as seamlessly as possible to version 3.5. So please speak up. Okay, I'm gonna bust in because I want to make sure I stay on time. Let's talk about what, at a very, very, very high level, what was the reason that we needed to move to version 3.5. It truly was the fact that we needed to reduce the burden of data collection on our providers. We had opened up suggested lists. We had elements like eDisposition 12 that were incredibly hard to kind of fend through while you're primarily caring for a patient, right? So how could we improve that? That's really what we tried to do, is to make the burden less on our clinicians by making the data collection more intuitive and make the data more usable and seems to be more directly related to their care and what they're doing. And then, of course, to be able to increase the value of the data by allowing it to be exchanged. So I'm going to walk through kind of all the major topics that were associated with the 3.5 development, and then the NEMSIS team, and actually Chip Cooper, who did a great job, heroic work with eDisposition 12, is also with us to kind of talk about some of the processes associated with moving to a new version within a state. So let's dig right in. I want to show this first because this is kind of the takeaway message. When we started working with 3.5, oh my gosh, you folks remember it. It was more than a year just working through well over 100 changes. There were almost 200, and just less than 100 of those changes were implemented. And when you took all that and you kind of distilled it all down, really, we only reduced the number of like mandatory elements that we know were collected across the country by 10. But we added some elements, right, that most states were collecting that are just important to collect. Many changes. It increased the efficiency and effectiveness of data collection, but really that process didn't reduce the number of elements, but it will greatly reduce the time required to complete an element. And a great example of that, of course, is the work that Chip did with eDisposition 12, right? We had this disposition element to try to define what happened with the call, and the current 3.4 just lists the same disposition for the patient in the example here over and over again, and then trying to give a disposition of the unit, right? And there's really, as you can see over here with the change to version 5, there really are 4 dispositions we were trying to capture. And if you try to do it this way, it just exponentially increases the number of options. And really, it makes it clear that in the current construction of eDisposition 12, there are scenarios you can't even capture, right? So that's why it was so important. We do move from 1 element, we move to 5 elements. 4 of them are mandatory. But the work that Chip did, the work that we did, kind of modeling this through an image trend product, it saved time, right? Just the ability to click through those 4 quickly was much easier than having to look at these exponentially growing lists with commas that just tried to come up with all the possible combinations. So we'll talk a lot about eDisposition 12 and the move to the new dispositions. We've also introduced the UUID, right? The universally unique ID that's associated with every record. And why did we do this? To increase the efficiency at the state being able to track personnel, equipment, and vehicles, or the resubmission of a record again, right? In the past, under version 3.4, we have to, most of the state software and here at the national level uses a hash where we add together a bunch of different elements that shouldn't change in a record. And then if we see that same hashed collection of elements in a new record coming in, we will replace the old record with a new record. But as we saw in Georgia and Oregon and many places, those elements that are here in red, they can change. They can change. Georgia came up with new agency numbers for every single agency in their state. Oregon had a situation where many of the calls had to change their unit notified time. And now that would produce 2 records in the state system. That would produce 2 records in the national system. So it just did not work as well as it will with a hash. So that's incredible valuable, I think, to you and to our agencies, because it'd just be much clearer and easier to submit records. And there's great value in the UUID as well. Kind of a secondary value of it is that it can be exchanged with other systems. This is clearly forward thinking, and we've had lots of discussion about this. This is in the future. This is 2 years, 3 years down the road. But as sister software comes into congruence with the NEMSIS standard, there'll be a way for all of an EMS record to be shared with your other state systems, NTDS, trauma, cardiac, stroke, the FARS data set with NHTSA. All of these are state level products. All of these are trying to pull EMS data out of an existing record. And it's just redundant, right? With this UUID in place, it reduces the burden on your state data collection because they don't have to collect it. Just identify the UUID and have the entire record move over. So this will be a great addition for you and your state. It will really help to save you money, save you resources at the state level. But we of course just can't have that UUID move data over if the same element in 2 independent registries are different, but talking about the same thing. So we've had Josh Legler working very hard to harmonize NEMSIS with CARES, with FARS, with the National Trauma Data Standard. If it's going to move over seamlessly, we've got to get the same element looking the same way in both of the registries. So we're actively involved in that as well. So that will really be a plus. Probably one of the most important things associated with the version 3 standard is being able to transition away from what were suggested lists. Wow, you can see here at the bottom for 2018, just for primary and secondary impression, we collected almost 7,000 different ICD-10 codes. But when we look at those 7,000 codes, 90% of those codes are represented by 120. There's just redundancy. There's someone's using a very detailed code and somebody's using a very generic code or unspecified code. If we eliminate that work that's done by some providers who are very detailed to look for detailed codes, and other providers that are so tired of doing that, they choose a non-specific code every time. I'm just going to choose pain. I'm just going to choose pain. That is such a burden on our providers. Having these defined lists that have a smaller set of codes will be incredibly valuable. Then just finally, we talked about the promise of being able to share data across the spectrum of healthcare and get patient outcomes back into the EMS records so that our EMS agencies can evaluate their performance. That also greatly increases with version 3.5. Number one, we removed untenable elements from eOutcome. I don't know, we were collecting days in the ICU. Well, no hospital collects that for meaningful use or for any of the CMS approved templates for exchanging data. So they would have had to calculate that for us specifically. And how do you count days, right? If someone's in the ICU for 3 hours, what is it? Oh my gosh, it was just a mess. So 3.5 removes those untenable elements. All the elements now in the eOutcomes section are found in meaningful use templates. So it's the exact data that they're exchanging. ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator, told us that we're moving to a FHIR standard rather than an HL7 version 3 standard. So we're making that move. We're doing all that we can to make sure that we can fall right in step with sharing data throughout the healthcare environment. Then finally, as an aside, Eric Chaney really led the effort to ensure that we're now testing the software much more often in regards to its compliance with the NEMSIS standard. They all drift. They just drift over time as you have requests and agencies have requests for changes. They hire new people who make those changes who weren't associated with the certification process. And you can see if you look here, there were many popular software that hadn't been tested since 2015 before we implemented this new process. So I'm grateful to Eric now that we have every software is tested every 2 years by our requirement. And there are states, for example, California, Mark out in California can talk about that. They want their compliance testing done every year. So most of the major software is tested for compliance yearly. So that's just a quick overview of the many things we're going to be talking about today. Keep in mind, any of these pieces that you want to really be able to effectively communicate to your providers or to your state, let's talk about it. What can we do to provide you with good resources to help you do that? And I think I'm at time, Julianne. I'll stop there. Are there any questions regarding this kind of high-level discussion or presentation?
Hey, Clay, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, Ann. Hi,
okay.
Ann.
So I'm hoping that I am misunderstanding something, and it's only when I've been looking at this more. It's not like it's the end of the world, but you mentioned taking out some of those outcome elements because they're not really something that an EMS agency is ever going to find out, which is completely true. But what we notice when we do our linkage, for example, with our trauma registry, where we get outcome data back, and I'm assuming if we get outcome data back later with the UUID association, that data is collected by our trauma center, number of days in ICU, and things like that. And I think the event days too. And so now we have nowhere to land that data when it gets re-imported into our system. I believe our particular state vendor is looking at creating a custom element that can still receive that data. But then we have to now pay, I think we're gonna have to pay our trauma registry vendor to reconfigure to send back. So it's turning into this thing where I'm like realizing, okay, next step, oops, now I gotta figure, okay, now how are we gonna do this? And so there's nowhere basically for that data to land from the linkage that would come back to us. And I know later on, NEMSIS will join to NTDB at that higher level, but we have nowhere to put it when it comes back to the state, I don't think, unless there's something I'm missing.
Yeah, and it's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. One of the pieces that we're working right now on, and there's an eOutcomes work group that's helping us with us, is developing this EMS side of the handshake for the exchange of that data. We're developing a template both in the old ADT model, so the NEM or the HL7 version 2, and also FHIR, that will exchange these like meaningful use approved elements. But there is a custom section in this, Ann. So if like Arizona wants to get vent days or wants to get ICU days, this template will include that custom section for, just like NEMSIS, you can add custom elements. You'll be able to add that to this template and just share that out with your hospitals or your trauma registries and say, hey, here's the new exchange template for our side of the handshake with your trauma registry, with your hospital EHR. And you can have anything in that custom section you want, Ann.
I think I'm actually the state that's on that work group, but the technical stuff is a little bit above me sometimes with the HL7 exchange. Like I'm still trying to put my hands around. I've been on a lot of calls when we did our linkage setup initially, and Oregon did something very similar. And I need to like get like a basic, HL7 for dummies thing on like what the A messages and the still can't get it all straight. So, in my head, I'm always kind of worried about where is this going to go? And are we going to have to pay something? And are we going to be able to find the money to house this in a way that it doesn't become an issue? We can find it. It's not getting sent different places. And different registries have to then make changes, which not only costs money, but sometimes is incredibly slow depending on, how busy the vendor is with any product to get changes made. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and great questions. And there's a lot of political stuff right in there in regards to your state, and there'll be specific state to state. But we have talked about maybe doing a primer for fire and for HL7, just so you feel more kind of educated as you're in those conversations with the state. We'll move forward with that. I'll make a note here. We've talked about doing kind of a 101 for fire and for HL7. We'll do that. Yeah, thank you. That's a good idea. Okay, Julianne, back to you. Keep on track.
Yep, we're doing great. So next up, we've got Monet is gonna talk to us for a little bit about a crosswalk from 3.4 to 3.5. Are you there, Monet? We can see your screen, but we cannot hear you.
Can you see me and hear me now?
Now we can see you and hear you and see your screen. So win, win, win.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending the 2021 Data Managers Bootcamp. I'm going to talk about the 3.4 to 3.5 crosswalk. I want to start by talking about the work group that was formed to review the recommendations. You can notice from this slide that one of the meetings that took place started back in October of 2017. And those work group meetings continued through 2019. So this group has been working for some time to revisit the suggestions to the standard. Here are the members of the work group, and I would like to thank everyone who's currently on the call who participated in the work group. Almost 7 data managers, many of the software vendors also participated. And then we had someone from Fire in addition to the NEMSIS Tech leadership team. You'll see here that I highlighted a name that some of you will be familiar with, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why that name was highlighted. So our dear friend, Juan Esparza, is a former data manager in the state of Florida. And Juan was very passionate about data, the collection of data, improving the standard. The reason I wanted to include Juan as part of this presentation has to do with he was one of the first people that I met when I came onto the NEMSIS team. This was back in 2011 at the national annual meeting up in Park City. One thing I recognized about Juan early on is that he was a gentle soul. I could ask him questions. He was willing to share his knowledge and experience with me. And once I was asked to review the changes to the standard, I saw that Juan's name was documented everywhere. During the review process, I also learned that very same week that he had passed away. And the notice of that absolutely broke my heart. I thought about all the things that he said to me, conversations that we had, and I also thought how important it is that although he's gone, he's still teaching lessons about the quality of the data. So I have included him in this presentation. Now, my first goal of the presentation is to review the changes and to describe what those changes are. The second goal is to describe products that we can use. In my conversations with many of you state data managers, you have expressed concern that you need more resources to share with your clinicians. And I think by working together that we can draft some really good information. I have listed a few of the comments that I have heard here. And my colleague, Lauri Bradt, will talk more about this as she has developed a poll to assess our needs. But if we're thinking about the EMS clinician, we can certainly think about short videos, 3 to 5 minute videos that talk about when and why documentation, quick tips, PowerPoint slides such as the ones that are used in the presentations today, module trainings, and even certificates. And some people are probably still interested in paperback materials. One of the first documents I really encourage everyone to become very familiar with is the NEMSIS Data Dictionary for the version 3.5 standard. You're going to gain a lot of information if you review this document and have your teams review this document on a regular basis. There's another document that's very valuable, and that's called the Extended Data Definitions. And these documents are located on the NEMSIS website. I have the link information provided here, and Lauri Bradt will also add that to the chat. Now, at a high level overview, we can see that there are a total of 640 elements in the 3.5 standard. They're broken up by section. So you can see in the EMS elements section, there are 441 elements. In the DIM section, there are 152. And in the state data set elements, there's 47 elements. And this document, again, is part of the NEMSIS Data Dictionary. So when I was looking at the revisions, I calculated 135 adjustments between 3.4 and 3.5. And so in the first part of the slide, you'll see there's a summary of those element changes. You can see that we added 26 elements, changed 91, removed 11, renamed 5, and then there were technical fixes to 2 elements. The spreadsheet really is the CSV document just converted. And I added the tabs that are listed here. So you have all of the 3.5 elements, the state-only elements, the national elements, and then the new elements that were added as part of 3.5, the state data set elements, and then the changes between 3.4 and 3.5. Now in the column, or sorry, on the tab that says changes, I have added columns that address specifically what was added, changed, removed, renamed, or technical fix. And then I also added the revision summary and the revision impact. And so you'll want to filter and look for the changes based on these options. So let's talk a little bit about some examples of the added elements. So there were 26 added elements, and I have listed the first 26 here. What I want to just show you is that there are 12 which are national and 13 which were state. And here's another breakdown of that information. What I've done here is I've added the revision summary information as well as the revision impact. And so just keep in mind that these are just examples of how you can present this information to your teams. Here's the only state added element, which was eSituation 19. Here are some added optional or recommended elements. And the thing that changed on this particular with these elements is the usage. And then now we're going to talk about some examples of the renamed elements. Here's a good example. In version 3.4, we had D state 01 and we had E state 01. And in version 3.5, they now are titled as S element 01. The next slide is a continuation of the renamed and retired elements. And you can see here that I have 5 elements listed. They belong to the deconfiguration and e-exam section. And I want to bring to your attention the e-exam 08, which was 1 element. And in version 3.5, it got separated into 4 additional elements. And here's an example of that split for e-exam 08. Now, here are the 47 renamed elements, which are now part of the state data set section. And I want to mention that every element in the state data set section is now a national element. Here are some examples of the state data set elements. One of the things I want to mention is the state data set. Many of you will remember how often I call you or email you and suggested that you update your state data sets. Now in version 3.5, your vendors will be responsible for the updates, and this is part of the compliance testing process. So you can all smile now because I won't need to remind you about manually updating your state data sets. One thing and an important change to mention about the state data set is the effective date is now added to the schema documentation for state data set. This information can also be found on the NEMSIS website under the Technical Resources tab under data dictionaries and SSDs, and then you'll scroll down towards the bottom and look for the V3 state API. So here are some examples of the state data set elements. And specifically, this is the section of S agency and S facility. I just wanted to mention that these are recommended elements. And then we have the state data set mandatory elements, which are the custom configuration elements. And you can see those listed here. Now I'm going to talk about some examples of elements that changed. And so we can see here that D agency elements changed in version 3.4. You can see that they were highlighted as national elements. In 3.5, they changed to state elements. And then we have another example of elements. The change has to do with them being recommended elements at this point, and they're the same, they're the D agency section. So here's another example of deconfiguration changes. You can see in version 3.4 that elements 2 through 5 were part of the 3.4 standard. And now in version 3.5, those elements are no longer listed here as they were in 3.4. On this particular slide, I'm showing you changes as it relates to mandatory elements, but the change actually is very specific to the revision summary. So you'll notice, for example, here, we removed the reference to the 2009 standard. Some of the other comments are listed here, and so you'll be able to quickly find what the changes were. And then we have some changes to D configuration elements and S configuration elements. One thing you'll notice here is we had D configuration 2 through 5. Number 4, which says medication permitted by state, is now S configuration 05, medications permitted by state. And there is a S configuration 04, which has to do with medication administered by certification level. Some additional changes to state elements, and the changes are listed here in the revision summary as well as in the revision impact. The specific changes for this section had to do with D personnel 24 and E procedures 13. The code list changed. And then for E vitals 8 and E protocols 2, they were national and now they're state recommended elements. Here's another example of some changes in the custom configuration. These elements changed from a minimum length of 0, and we increased that length to 2. These changes actually do not impact the provider experience. And now we have some changes to some optional elements, and I've highlighted this section here to indicate that the changes are specifically identified in the revision summary. 23 of these changes were made to the optional elements. And now we're going to talk about some examples of the removed elements. And so you'll see here that we have ERS 05 through 8, which were removed, DEAC e-disposition 12, which is a huge change. And my colleague, Ben Fisher, will talk more about that in his presentation. And then we had several changes to eOutcomes section, and my colleague, Atim Effiong, will talk about those changes. And then the last changes has to do with the technical fixes. And here I have listed 2 elements that had changes. These do improve the provider experience, and the specific change has to do with the max length, and then a constraint pattern change on the other element. Now, I realized that the crosswalk document was very busy, but you're not on this journey alone. We at the NEMSIS TAC are here to help you. And I would probably say that the state managers, your colleagues across the nation who've been doing this work for some years, especially those listed in the work groups, will probably be available for help as well. I can't say yes, but I assume based on my experience with many of them that they'll be willing to help because we are all in this together. So totally reach out for help. We're here for you. Now, I wanted to just say as a summary that good data can provide a great story. Here are some of the reasons that I've listed for why we should collect good data. Provides accurate and complete PCRs to the receiving facility for continuum of care, proper and timely reimbursement and funding, state rules and regulations, evaluation of clinical performance, EMS system performance, public health surveillance and research, and clinical and academic research. And just in summary, Juan had an undeniable passion for good EMS data collection. His example helped reignite a personal kind of fire in me to help me continue on this journey in this profession. And so if you have lost your fire or need to reignite it, just think about all the reasons, the personal reasons why you're involved in EMS data collection. And I am done with my presentation, but here's my contact information. And so if you need any help, please feel free to reach out and I'll do the best that I can to assist you. And I believe it's time now for, well, actually I'll ask, are there any questions that I can answer?
Monet, can you say again where this is going to be posted on the NEMSIS website?
Yes, ma'am. So the Excel spreadsheet will be on the NEMSIS website under technical resources, data dictionaries, and XSDs. That Excel spreadsheet will be listed there under the CSV document. And then the PowerPoint presentations, we sent that out to all the participants who registered, and I'm sure we can send that out to you again. And then on our NEMSIS, the homepage, we have a version 3 tab. And so a lot of the resource information will be listed there. But please feel free to reach out, and I actually want to thank you because I had some conversations with you early on, and I anticipated some of your needs, but you also clarified explicitly what you wanted. And so thank you for assisting me and helping me to put the Excel spreadsheet together.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for providing this. This is going to be really helpful.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, this is Clayman. I think we'll also just mention that we'll probably make these PowerPoint presentations available in some location on the website for the data managers as well. Yes.
So if there are no other questions, we are going to take a 5-minute break.
Hey, Monet?
Yes, sir.
We're running a little bit ahead of time. Can I take you back in your slide presentation to, it's probably like slide 4 or slide 5, where you actually go through the addition, the elements that were added. It just provides a good example of what we need to try to do to provide you as a state with information that's important to your providers compared to those that are important to the state. So keep going forward. Good, good, good. Okay, right here is a good, let's see, added V3 elements. Yeah, this is a great example, right? So here this looks like we added 26 new elements to the V3 standard. And this lists all the elements, right? So all of the outcome elements, and there's many elements in here that their purpose was to increase the efficiency and use of the PCRs, make them more easy to use, or it's e-outcome data that really our providers don't need to collect, right? So we want to make sure that when we communicate this to our providers, we don't get an initial feeling from them like, oh my gosh, there's 26 more elements I need to complete. Well, that's really not true, right? Particularly among the national elements, right? So anything that we can do to help you properly communicate this information in a way that will be helpful, we'd love to talk about.
And this excludes the state data set section.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, which is just completed once per agency, right? So there's, yeah. So the experience of our providers, we've tried to really hone and make that much more streamlined. Is there any questions about all this? Monet did a great job of going through it. There's lots of information here, lots of technical work here.
If I can add a comment as well, I put it in the chat. The PDF links that everyone was sent for each presentation is note-taking friendly. So if you open up those PDFs, like for Monet's presentation, you'll see her slides, and then there's a spot for you to take notes, your thoughts, whatever you want on those, and then save them with your notes. So those are available to everybody for your convenience as well.
Well, if there are no additional questions, stay on the line with us, or feel free to take a break, stand up, stretch your legs, grab some coffee or some water. But make sure you come back, because Ben Fisher is going to talk about the split, the benefits and the changes of eDisposition 12. And so you don't want to miss that information.
Let's just take a 5-minute break. On my clock, it's 9:48, so let's come back at 9:53. Stretch, grab a drink, don't get sucked into your email, come back and be with us. Chris is going to put up just a slide for the break time. And then if you haven't had an opportunity, go ahead and update your name on the participant list with the state that you represent. And that helps the other participants to kind of get to know you a little bit. Everybody on this group has been, or everybody in this meeting has been specifically invited. So we appreciate you being here. Hopefully everybody had a chance to get up and stretch. I know in our world of Zoom meetings, sometimes we end up sitting in our seat a little bit too long each day. All right, next on our agenda for this morning, we are going to be able to hear from Ben Fisher with the NEMSIS TAC. We've been really grateful to have Ben as part of our team too. So Ben's going to talk about some of the changes to incident and patient disposition. Ben, it is all you.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen real quick. So I know both Clay and Julianne have kind of mentioned some pretty big, exciting changes to eDisposition 12. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what those changes are, why they were changed, and some of the impact to providers as well as state data managers. Hopefully, it'll be a little bit easier to look at this data and see what's actually happening with field crews. if you would like, these are links to the version 3 data dictionaries. You might want to follow along if it's possible for you to have a tab open with the 3.4 eDisposition 12 and the new 3.5 definitions. We're going to run through some examples in a little bit. It might kind of help to be able to look at both of those. I'll show you those here in just a second when we talk about some of the examples. So, incident disposition really simply is what happened at the end of the incident. And in 3.4, there was some ambiguity about what happened to the patient, EMS crew, and the vehicle, because those three things could potentially do different things, go different places, and go there at different times. In a multi-tiered ALS response, you could potentially have a paramedic on a first response ALS engine show up, provide care, and then a ambulance show up from another service, and potentially even have the paramedic from the engine return back in service before the call for the transport was completed. So then you wind up with some, weird values for what did that crew actually do in terms of treatment, but they did not transport, and it could get a little confusing. The other thing that we noticed was to accommodate some of these outcomes and try to stop having to kind of hammer this square peg into a round hole for dispositions that didn't quite fit the element list, is states created, I think we were up to 14 custom elements now. So hopefully this will make your lives easier as state data managers to not have to track quite so many custom elements by accommodating what's actually happening. So real quick, this first part will be a little bit dry. I want to run through what the old elements were just to refresh everyone's memory, and then show some of the new elements and sort of what they look like. You can see this list for the 3.4 eDisposition 12 had gotten kind of lengthy. So in addition to cancellations and assists, there was this very long list of patient treated, comma, and then other values. And so this value list was becoming very long, which in itself increased the length of documentation. So even though we are creating additional fields, hopefully the documentation will actually be sped up, because these additional value lists will be much shorter. So it will be much easier to readily see what value you're hoping to select, instead of having to scroll through this very long list of old eDisposition 12 values. So the new elements, they will be eDisposition 27 through 31, 27, 28, 29, and 30. Those are the national elements that say what happened to the vehicle, what happened to the patient, what happened to the crew, and then was the patient ultimately transported, and if so, if yes, how so? And then reason for refusal release already existed, and now it's going to get tucked in under eDisposition 12, because it is the most logical place for that to exist now. So real quick, so eDisposition 27, excuse me. So the definition for these, I'll just read real quickly out loud. So the patient disposition for an EMS event identifying whether patient contact was made. I think this is really important, especially as data managers. You want to be able to quickly filter out, are you looking at all EMS events? Are you looking at EMS events where just a patient was contacted? That's kind of an important filter if you're trying to create a denominator to do quality assurance. And so I think that hopefully this data element will make that much clearer. The second one is patient evaluation and care. What level of care was provided? So the patient disposition for an EMS event, identifying whether a patient was evaluated and care or services were provided. The crew disposition. So the crew disposition for this EMS event, identifying which crew provided primary patient care and whether support services were required. And then how was the patient transported? The transport disposition for an EMS event, identifying whether a transport occurred and by which unit. And then finally, the reason for refusal or release. So if it was against medical advice refusal, a normal refusal, or potentially a pronouncement. Okay, so real quick, I'll see if anybody has any questions so far, please feel free to type in the chat. But I'm going to run through a couple of examples, and if you're able to pull up the data definition or the data dictionaries, I think that will certainly be helpful. And I'm actually going to pull up the old eDisposition 12 definitions, and we'll run through a couple kind of, we'll start with some simple ones and then make them a little bit more complicated. So at least one example, you can think of a flight crew that lands at an airport, fixed wing flight crew, and then they're going to contract with a private ambulance service to transport that last 2 miles to the hospital. So the flight crew arrives, they're loaded into a private ambulance and then transported that last bit, but the flight crew stays in the back of the ambulance. They remain the primary care provider, and it might even be a BLS ambulance that's providing transport. So you can see how for eDisposition 12, it might be kind of difficult to try and document as that, BLS ambulance provider, even though they're in the back. The flight crew has held on to patient care. So would the EMT in the back of the ambulance select that the patient was treated and transported by this EMS unit? Yes, they were transported by this EMS unit, but does that accurately reflect that they provided treatment if they weren't the primary caregiver and they're not responsible for the potentially critical care level of care in the back of an ambulance? That that would seem kind of weird for an EMT basic to be providing care for that level of patient. So that's kind of an extreme example. You can also see in the new data elements. So instead of having to select treated and transported, you would come over to eDisposition 27, and you can see that patient contact was made. They are responsible for the potentially responsible for the patient. They provided support services, so this may more accurately reflect that they were not the primary caregiver for that patient. And then you can see exactly what happened. So they provided care supporting the primary EMS crew. So there's a value right there that they're able to select that more accurately reflects their role on a call like that. And then getting into more day-to-day things, you can imagine a multi-tiered fire ALS system that provides first response. So they arrive and they don't transport, but they do treat this patient and they do provide care. So you can see that with the older eDisposition 12, they arrive and they start providing care. Well, they treated this patient and they didn't really refuse them, but did they transfer care to another EMS unit? That becomes difficult to track because the patient was transported, but how were they transported? And you essentially have to look for multiple EPCRs from the two records to try and identify what happened to this patient. How did the patient get to the hospital if you're just looking at that first EPCR record? But you can see that with the new values, you would pretty quickly be able to see that that fire crew would be able to select something like the patient was evaluated and then care was provided. They actually did care for this patient. And then because the transport disposition is separated out, they're more accurately able to document what actually happened to the patient and how they were transported. So our hope is that the changes allow for much more accuracy in documentation. People aren't trying to kind of really use their brain power to think about how, what did I actually do in this role? Am I squishing a value to try and fit what actually happened? And it gives everyone the flexibility for some of these unique responses and then some of these agencies. And our hope is it really does speed up documentation because they'll be much more quickly able to select values that more quickly and accurately reflect what happened on a call. So I can certainly run through.
Hey, Ben.
Yes.
Would you go back just a little ways? Amber had a really good question in the chat, but she's just looking for how a BLS crew would document that another agency provided care.
Yeah. So using the new elements, they would start probably by selecting that they did make patient contact, that they provided support services, and then most likely provided care supporting primary EMS crew. Oh, where do they actually list the name or ID of the other agency? Claire or Julianne, do you know the answer to that one?
Where they actually list the crew number for the other agency. Oh, that's a great question. There's a first on scene, second on scene section where I guess that would potentially be put in.
Josh says eScene 02 through 4 and 24.
Yep. That would be an eScene, I think. Yep. There you go.
Yep, there you go. Responder group, other EMS or public safety agencies at the scene.
Does it, would you open those?
Mhm.
Does it? Okay, so it is a data string, right? Okay, yep.
Let's see here. So, and then Jay, you were asking about non-transporting crews that assist. So there are, let's see here. So there are values for provided care supporting the primary EMS crew, initiated primary care, and then transferred to another EMS crew, as well as, I'm sorry, transport disposition. So then you would be able to say that the transport was provided either by them as a riding in as a member of another crew or with a member of another crew, or that they did the transport. If they transported to a landing zone but actually provided treatment, how would you document this? So Cassie's question, I'm assuming you're speaking about something like they're driving to a helicopter. That would be a more typical 911 transport scenario. So they would be able to document that they evaluated the patient and care was provided, and then that the let's see here, crew disposition, then they would document that they initiated and transferred to another EMS crew. So initiated primary care and transferred to another EMS crew. And then, sorry, didn't go far enough. And then transport disposition, that transport was by another EMS unit. And then Ridgely's question, can it be assumed that member could be members? Yes, I believe.
Yeah, great questions. Those are great questions. And I wonder if it speaks to a need. Cassie, Ridgely, any of you folks, and could we develop in our training materials just a couple of scenarios that are pretty straightforward so they can be easily tracked, but would be difficult to document under the current eDisposition 12, and maybe show how it would be documented under the new 4 elements? Would that be helpful for you? Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, folks. Okay, yeah, we'll do that.
And then just to wrap up, there are resources available in your resource guide. So there's a presentation from the work group that created the new values that kind of talks about why the disposition elements were split, as well as V3 mapping and translation tools. So obviously, as states transition to 3.5, you'll want to be able to kind of map these elements. So we do offer some mapping and translation tools for all of the new elements. And with that, I'm happy to keep answering questions or go through additional scenarios, but I think kind of to Clay's point, we can certainly come up with a document if that's helpful to everyone that to try and clarify some of these scenarios.
Are there any other scenarios that are unique to your areas that would be good to include in these descriptions? Okay, Jason's, yeah, not possible to consider every scenario, but if there's ones that you guys know you always struggle with, let us know, because we can guess, and we'll go off of the descriptions and some of the comments here to help flesh out some of those scenarios.
Yeah, yeah, Anne made a great comment there. Amber, let's see, eScene, yes, is one to many. Yeah, since eScene 01 indicates the first responding, and then the group eScene 02 through eScene 04 deals with anyone else who might be on scene. Yeah, you're right, fire, flight.
Thanks, Clay. I'm just trying to think, there might be a need if we're asking sort of the agency that didn't provide care to list the agency that did provide care, so that then we would maybe refer or somehow connect those patient care reports to deduplicate or that sort of thing. And so if there's maybe 3 agencies that respond to a single patient, how would we know which one is the one that provided care? I mean, I'm sure we could dig and figure it out, but that just might be a need.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you, Amber. That's a good question. So I'll make note of that. Jason also speaks to that same kind of topic, right? Is there some scenarios we haven't thought of that may require a hot fix? I'll respond to that just quickly. Chip Cooper, the EMS data manager from New Hampshire and also an active provider, came up with an spreadsheet. I don't remember, Chip, how many combinations of scenarios were on that Excel spreadsheet, but there was probably at least 250. And so we tried to make sure that any combination of any of those scenarios would be captured by the 4 elements. Do you remember that, Chip? I don't remember how many were listed, but it was crazy.
Yeah, I don't remember either. I can see if I can track it down, but I can tell you that we had probably 4 to 6 months of back and forth discussion to try and make sure we provided enough robustness and option for crews to try and capture pretty much everything. I'm sure crews will have to get used to some things like transported a vehicle to a helicopter. Really, you're transporting in your vehicle and you're handing off care to most helicopters are really representing a hospital or something like that. So you're done. You're done with your care at that point. And so that would be a scenario that might be handled a little differently than someone said, well, I transported, then we gave it to somebody else and they transported. Sometimes you have to kind of just decide, here's the standards. And I see, like somebody asked about provided care supporting a primary agency. So my agency shows up and the other agency's primary, I go and maybe start an IV or help them, put bandaging on or something like that, but they're still the primary service. That's the kind of scenario that would be used for. I know in our state, that's a question that comes up all the time. They're like, we weren't really in charge, but we gave them a little help, but we didn't initiate care. Like, what do we do with that? And so we did spend a substantial amount of time going through and finding scenarios and adding and adjusting the labels to try and make all those accommodations as clear as we could. I'll see if I could find that mapping out, because we did spend kind of a lot of time coming up with as many weird things as we could, talking to states that had different care plans and crew configurations and that kind of thing.
Hey, Ben, this is Josh. Actually, if you could bring that responder group or the eScene section back up, thanks for sharing that. I just wanted to point out that eScene.02, 03, and 04 have not changed in version 3.5. These elements have been there all along in version 3. The only change in 3.5 in this section was the addition of eScene.24 to that repeating group. So essentially what you're doing here is you're listing the agencies, the other agencies that were on the scene. And for one of those agencies, you'll mark eScene.24 as yes, to indicate that that agency was the first one to provide patient care on the scene. Now, it might be helpful also to say, well, who had primary care? That would have to be a custom element, but would have had to be custom back in the previous versions of NEMSIS as well. So just keep in mind that the only change was the addition of eScene.24 to that repeating group. Everything else is consistent across versions.
All right, well, with that, I'm right at my time, and I will hand things over to Atim to start talking about the benefits of modifying eOutcomes. So thank you all, and please feel free to type more questions in the chat or send me an email.
All right, thank you, Ben. So next we're going to talk about the benefits of modifying the eOutcome section. So we'll do an overview. We'll discuss the differences between version 3.4 and 3.5 of the eOutcome section. We'll talk about what the changes mean for states and EMS clinicians, and then we'll do a nice summary at the end. So to get us started, we'll actually start with just a poll to get an idea of what better outcome data would mean for your state. So if you're using your computer, you can type in this link, pollev.com/Lauri Bradt 384. Or if you're on your phone, you can text Lauri Bradt 384 to 37607 and then text the code 123. So I'll give you all a couple of seconds to get to that location, and then I'll have you answer a question. And so that question will be, in one word or phrase, what would better outcome data mean to your state? And so you can see here again the information to participate in the poll. So I'll give you a few seconds to join, and then you can add your response. Completeness, the first one. Continuity. Some similar responses. Improved, lots of options coming in. Great. Awesome. So we've had a lot of different ideas and words coming in. So understanding, care seems to be a big one, probably repeated often. Understanding, hospital, improved. I see feedback in there a few different times, collaboration, performance, improvement. Awesome. Thank you everyone for participating. This gives a really good understanding of kind of the true benefits that will come from your state being able to have more of that outcome data more consistently. Okay, so for our overview, we'll start with the goal of the eOutcome section. So that is to get the outcomes data back, and getting the outcomes data back provides data back to agencies and to states to evaluate performance, which makes the data that's collected even more valuable. There's been a lot of talk about getting the outcomes data back after an EMS run is completed, and there have been efforts to move this forward since version 3 of the NEMSIS standard. And one of the aspects of the changes to the eOutcome section in NEMSIS 3.5 is one of the things that we're working on to help get that outcomes data back. Currently at a national level, only about 4% of records have outcomes data. But these changes in 3.5 will provide the structure that is needed for consistent outcomes data in a timely fashion. And this will truly enrich the national database and the state databases as well. So we'll go over what has changed and then what you as a state data manager can do to facilitate. So starting with what's changed, if you take a look here, this is a screenshot from the data dictionary for version 3.4. So you can see the elements that are currently being collected and are available. In version 3.5, this is a screenshot from the 3.5 data dictionary. So looking at them side by side, what are some things that stick out to you as different? So you can put your response in the chat. You can unmute yourself, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at this and kind of identify some things that are different between version 3.4 and version 3.5 for the eOutcome section. So the grouping is something that Dave has mentioned, Dave Rogers from Minnesota. Kevin Putnam says grouping and national elements. Let's see if we can hear from one more. And then David Newton says the times of procedures. Great, thank you. So let's go ahead and break down these changes. So first we'll start with what's staying the same. So the top section of the eOutcome section will be staying the same. So eOutcome 01 and 02 will carry over in their current formats, and then the eOutcome external data group will stay the same, and that is what is used to link the EMS record to the hospital record. So those things are staying the same. Now let's look at what's changing. So many of the elements were optional in 3.4, and as a few people have mentioned, they are now required national and state elements in version 3.5. And this is to allow for more access to the outcome data at a state and national level. Fortunately, there's no burden to the EMS clinicians because the outcome data are not collected by EMS. EMS can only get elements that a hospital has, and hospitals exchange data under meaningful use, which includes many templates funded through CMS. The hospital gets paid to use these templates, and the template that is most useful for the EMS outcomes data is the patient care summary. And the items in the patient care summary influence the NEMSIS outcome elements. And because of that, there are some changes that have taken place in 3.5 to kind of accommodate the information that's in the patient care summary. So if you look on the left under version 3.4, you'll see the items or the elements that are highlighted in blue. So those elements, eOutcome 06, 07, 08, 14, 15, and 17 are being retired because they are not generally included in the patient care summary. They require extra calculations or programming, which makes them more difficult to get, sometimes not possible. But if you look at the remaining elements, and then the elements on the right under 3.5 that are in orange, those orange ones are new elements for 3.5. And so all of the remaining elements, and then the ones in orange, are all elements that are already collected in the patient care summary. So what does this mean for you? As a state data manager, you will consistently get back outcomes data to measure and assess EMS performance. And all of this communication between EMS and hospitals will enhance that value of the health information exchange between EMS and hospitals. So while making the changes to the eOutcome section doesn't automatically make all of this eOutcomes data come back, there is a standardized a standardized eOutcomes template that the NEMSIS TAC has been working on with their eOutcomes group to standardize this handshake between hospital EHR systems and EMS. So this handshake will make use of FHIR, which is the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, and is the new standard for health information exchange. It facilitates the correct record linkage through the NEMSIS UUID and reduces the cost of health information exchange for states and agencies. And what does this mean for EMS clinicians? So this will allow for more timely information regarding patient outcomes. And this has the potential to improve EMS clinician performance and to make any modifications to the base care practice. For example, clinician might be able to more timely know if the CPR they provided was effective, whether they had missed an intubation, or how effective the shock or the control of shock they performed was for the patient. And this is nearly real-time data that allows for possibilities for behaviors or skills to be assessed and modified as needed. As mentioned, the EMS clinicians will have real-time feedback on their performance. Currently, clinicians have to wait to get feedback from their performance. That might be from a registry where the data are a year old, and a clinician may not remember a run from a year ago. But with version 3.5, clinicians will have real-time feedback, which will allow for a more immediate review of performance and to identify any areas for improvement on more recent runs. So to summarize, we were able to identify the changes between version 3.4 and version 3.5, including the items that are staying the same, changing, are new, or have been retired. And the eOutcomes changing in version 3.5 opens the door to consistent outcomes data at an EMS clinician, state, and national level. With that, does anyone have any questions about the changes in the eOutcomes section?
Yeah, so are those connections with the eOutcomes section in the hospital, are those going to be automatic with the UUID when that's implemented and everything kind of interconnects?
I might let Clay respond for that one.
Yeah, it's a great question, Sharon. I think the UUID will help with the connection to ensure that it's unique. But I think the template that we're putting together with the work group, there is some exchange from the agency to the hospital of PII, personal information about the patient, just because that's allowed under HIPAA as they exchange kind of healthcare information. So the UUID will be helpful and will make sure that you have a more clear connection. But the UUID will not, of course, exist initially at the hospital sites. We'll just be sharing it with the hospital. There'll be other PII and PHI that will actually be exchanged to make sure the link's done on both sides. But that's a great question.
Okay, so the hospital is still going to have to put the outcome data elements in on their side. So, I mean, they have to do it manually still before the pre-hospital providers would be able to obtain it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So say at the hospital, a patient arrives and they're completing the hospital record, nursing notes, physician notes, as a patient is going through their care. And then there are CMS approved templates that if the hospital wants to exchange data or is agreed to exchange data with outside sources, they use those prepared templates, and the patient care summary is the one that we'll be relying on. It just summarizes their care and provides values for those elements that we've included in the 3.5 version of eOutcomes. So yeah, if an agency, the end of the week, calls into St. Mary's Hospital and said, hey, we transported 3 patients earlier in the week to you. Can we get this information back? Then they will have entered the data, right? The nurses enter the data, the doctors enter the data, all that they do to complete a patient care report at the hospital. But it'll be able to pull that information electronically using FHIR or right now they're using mostly kind of a version 2 of HL7 called ADT messages, which stands for admit, discharge, and transfer messaging. We're going to build this handshake using ADT as well, just to deal with current implementations. But yeah, that'll just be electronic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see Amber put a note in it that it would be nice to have some training on this. So I don't know if that's in the works down the road or not.
Oh yeah, happy to do that. And I think this whole environment has become really complex, right? I think you're right, and Amber's right, that our agency is going to get this data back directly from hospitals, or is EMS agency data going to go into an HIE within a state, and then they call back into that HIE to get information on the hospital, say, that's been connected by the HIE, right? It's really a complex environment out there. And I think all we can do to deal with all those complexities is have our handshake template standardized, whether ImageTrend's reaching out for us or Zoll's reaching out for us, whoever, there'll be this one template that's our end of sharing data or requesting data back. And then hopefully everybody can write to it based on these complex networks of how data will be shared. But I think a lot of the complexity now is it's a one-off every time in Colorado or in Utah or in California that we want to exchange data. There's a 6-digit cost with this one-off connection that needs to be built, and it's just way too expensive and too complex. I hope that helps. So I tried to kind of address Amber's question. It is complex. Hopefully just having the standardized approaches will help from our end. And then Johnny asks a good question. No, it's a great question, and that will be built into the implementations, right? I just imagine, I mean, I'm just kind of imagining now, but the eOutcomes work group with NEMSIS is working on this. I would imagine that a provider can show up at work, on Monday, and there'll be something associated with their software that says, hey, this red flashing button indicates you've got some outcome data, So that will kind of be an implementation process that will be associated with each software package.
Okay, and then Dan Lee asks, is there any sense of how big a barrier hospital information sharing concerns will be?
Yeah, gosh, that's a great question, Dan. So we have 3 contractors that are helping us with FHIR implementations, CDA implementations, and Josh is going to help with some mapping between FHIR, for example, and the NEMSIS XSD. So we've got the technical piece covered. Greg Mears is joining our team. Many folks will remember Dr. Mears. He was very early on to, and actually developed the original idea for NEMSIS. He's going to lead the technical piece, but his piece is also, his work will also be associated with how do we work with the Office of the National Coordinator and with the Office of EMS to develop products. I like the new HIPAA document that we just put out. How can we continue to provide educational information that will reduce that weird barrier? Dan, your comment is a good one. The first time we tried to do this, to develop an eOutcome section through HL7, the hospital representatives were in the room and they said, you can ballot that request for eOutcomes data all you want. You're not going to get it from us. We're not going to calculate vent days or ICU days for you unless you pay us money. So you're right, there's political boundaries, there's patient care confidentiality boundaries, there's will hopefully not only offer some technical resources, but also some more resources related to those topics as well, Dan. It's a great question.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions regarding the eOutcomes section? Okay, with that, I will turn the time over to Julianne to discuss defined lists.
All right, we'll spend a few minutes talking about defined lists and how we got to this place in 3.5. Thank you, Atim. Let's go back one more. So we've had lots of discussions about suggested lists and defined lists over the last couple of years. So this will be a pretty broad overview. It'll be new for some of you, but many of you that participate in the V3 calls, we've had a lot of discussion about this. It's been a long journey, and we really appreciate the input that we've received from all of our stakeholders, the vendors, the clinicians, the states. It's been very helpful. So just to recap a little, in 2016, NEMSIS developed suggested lists of codes for elements that utilize national standardized code sets. And the use of these lists was not mandatory, and the data collected reflected an enormous variety of codes that were not always applicable to EMS. In 2019, we evaluated those lists for frequency and also for appropriateness to EMS. A work group consisting of the TAC, data managers, other stakeholders, vendors, and some clinicians, we participated in meetings to discuss and approve a process to require the use of the 2019 suggested lists. 13 of these elements were identified as benefiting from shifting their suggested list into a defined list. And it's important to note that lists such as ICD-10 and SNOMED, RxNorm, they were created primarily for hospital-based medical care or for billing specifically. Adaptation to the EMS industry has required some fine-tuning for those vast lists. So as we refined those suggested lists to those values that were most often used and that were most appropriate for pre-hospital medical care, in 3.5, it was determined that those defined lists would be a required aspect of ePCR software vendor field products. So the defined lists, they must be presented in the ePCR interface to the clinician at the time of patient care documentation. And these lists will improve the accuracy of documentation by eliminating obscure, redundant, frivolous values. I'm going to pick on falls for just a minute. This is an example of some of those redundant and more obscure values that we see in the data that don't necessarily apply to emergency or pre-hospital care. So over the last 3 years, 277 different codes have been used for cause of injury that were a fall. So if a clinician has to hunt and peck or search through these long lists of ICD-10 codes to find a code that fits, the data may end up with the data ended up with values that were just all over the place. The bulk of them rested in this, fall on same level or accidental fall that you see in this example. But there were many other random values that were selected that don't necessarily apply to EMS or of a level of specificity that makes it difficult to really complete documentation in a reasonable amount of time when you're in the field. We've got ICD-10 specifically has obscure codes that describe initial, subsequent, sequela encounters that don't necessarily apply in a 911 EMS response. And how did an agency decide on which codes to include when there's so many to choose from? Oops, let's go back. I'm getting all kinds of excited. So as we looked at developing defined lists, these provide a level of guidance on common codes to use in EMS. Are 17 codes enough to accurately describe a fall in pre-hospital emergency 911 response? 17 is a pretty good number to choose from. So if a clinician is in the field and they're trying to do accurate documentation, they can look at this defined list, find fall, choose from 17 options, and if there's really not one that applies to their situation or to that call, they can add a value. But as we developed these defined lists, we really tried to target what is most common in the field. And this speaks to that dilemma of specificity versus PCR completion. Researchers really love that nitty-gritty detail, specificity, but in the field, the clinician needs to complete a record with good documentation, but isn't necessarily concerned with the minutiae, the obscurity of some of these codes that they've had to just rifle through. We've described that the defined lists are expected to be presented to the clinicians in the field software graphical interface, and this is 3.5. This was one of the questions that we got as we were planning and talking about and asking for your input on topics for this boot camp. How do we address not growing? Sorry, I'm going to get to that one next. We're going to talk about the flexibility next. So in this one, for the implementation, I've got my eye on two different slides. So these values outside of the defined lists, they are required, or they are allowable. Software vendors can implement the defined list, and then as flexibility needs, values can be added. We also provide a standard code roll-up that all reported codes at the national and the state level can be properly aggregated for performance assessment and for research purposes, but this does not affect or change the original code that was entered in the field. That was a very specific request that documentation always stay accurate to what was included in the original PCR. So now we're going to talk about flexibility. And this was one of the questions that we got from one of the data managers is, how do we avoid going back to that enormous list if flexibility is allowed? So, we looked at developing a list that would be appropriate for end to end in the country, and that's not necessarily specific enough for every nuance of the industry. The position that the TAC is taking is that we encourage states and agencies to use caution when adding or allowing additional codes in that EMS documentation. Any additional codes, they should be evaluated that's appropriate for that area or that type of service, and that it's not already accurately described in an existing code. These lists were designed to include a greater than 90% of the needed codes, or the codes that are currently in use to document a patient encounter. And it's not possible to address every nuance. And I've put up here, California and Colorado get my examples on this PowerPoint. Colorado probably doesn't document a lot of surfing injuries, where California probably doesn't document a whole lot of skiing injuries. There's some flexibility that has to be built into the program to allow for accurate documentation in those situations. And this also applies to critical care, air medical, telemedicine, transport teams. They're going to need additional codes that a typical 911 response crew may not utilize. So there has to be that level of ability to add as needed, but we do encourage states to be a little stingy, to be a little careful when they're asking vendors to add codes to those defined lists. So this is just an example of the hierarchical structure of our defined lists. It should allow the clinician to start with a general classification. I'm using impression in this example. They should be able to find cardiovascular as a parent code for an impression, and then be able to select from a more specific list that is unique to that parent classification. So if they're looking at, a primary and secondary impression of a cardiovascular incident, they can select cardiac arrest, chest pain, myocardial infarction, different options that are most commonly seen in that pre-hospital 911 response. The other part of this is we have developed a standardized EMS description for the EMS clinician to reduce some of the variations across software. So you can see we show what the underlying ICD-10 code is and what the official ICD-10 description is. But for field documentation, seeing an ICD-10 description, if I'm trying to complete good documentation, I want simple, I want straightforward, I want accurate, but I'd rather see arrhythmia as my choice than cardiac arrhythmia unspecified. So the EMS description that we provide in the defined list just help to standardize that front-facing description just for the clinician in the field. So these are the data elements that are directly impacted by the defined lists, and that is procedures, medications, symptoms, impressions, causes of injury, and incident location type. Some of them, like e-procedures, that's one that the clinicians are going to see in every ePCR that they encounter. The configuration elements, those are a little bit more under the hood as the software product is developed. There are elements that in the past we have provided suggested lists for, but these are not going to be associated with defined lists. So e-history for medication allergies, environmental food, medical surgical history. There are suggested lists as a launching point for what may make sense to include in a list. Many states and vendors use these lists for convenience only. Implementation is not required. These remain suggested and not defined and required in 3.5. Some of them have been around for a little while. Each of them have been updated or in the process of being updated, but because they're not required, we don't have that same level of visibility at the national level for what is used most frequently. So as you look at these, or as you use these for convenience in building out your lists, if you recommend changes to it, send it to us. We asked several states and vendors to share with us what they currently use for allergies, surgical history, and patient activity. And a few states and a couple of vendors were willing to share with us what they were providing, what they're using at this time. And so that's been really helpful because we don't have that visibility on the frequency of use because they are state and optional elements and don't come to the national database. Current medications does not have an associated list. It's far too varied. RX norm codes that fit the pattern can be used here. What I've seen in the field is that vendors will utilize a smart lookup for this data element, and that helps to reduce some of the bizarre spellings you get in free text fields. So depending on the graphical interface of the vendor, this can vary quite a bit. The impact to stakeholders was a really important consideration when we looked at implementing defined lists. The process had to make documentation easier and more accurate for clinicians without an unreasonable burden to states and vendors. You know, it's this magic balance that everyone tries to find. The process had to be applicable to all states and territories, which resulted in some generalization for defined lists and influenced that need for flexibility, because in this situation, a one-size-fits-all approach didn't allow for that needed customization in specific areas. Clinicians should have an improved user experience with data elements utilizing defined lists with their vendor software. State and territory offices of EMS, they may need to offer some training to their agencies to help them see the benefit. So there's an impact to state and territory offices of EMS in that outreach, that education, helping to teach and encourage that good documentation. The significant impact is to software vendors. That is more pronounced. So when they are completing compliance testing for 3.5, they are required to demonstrate how their software presents a defined list. NEMSIS at the TAC, we do not dictate how that software user interface will look. We don't dictate how they will present those codes, but we do validate that their software implements the defined lists, and we do validate that they can add a custom element, or not a custom element, an additional value that isn't included in the defined list, because we recognize that was very clear from the very beginning that occasionally a code is going to need to be added to a list that is presented to the field clinician. So in the field, we said the software user interface has a wide variety. It could be a pick list. It could be a smart lookup. There are different ways that this is presented in the field software. In your note-taking slides, you've got examples from 3 different vendors. And that were gracious enough to share with us a screenshot of their interface. And these vendors use hierarchy, or they use a smart lookup for impressions or medications. Huge thank you to AngelTrack and ESO and Fireworks. Not that NEMSIS endorses one product over another, and all vendors were invited through the Google group to send us a screenshot of their user interface. And we appreciate these vendors that were willing to share that with you. I'm only going to show one during this presentation because our time just filled up really fast with these presentations. So here's an example from Fireworks on how they implemented the defined list. Thank you to Benny Shaliv for sharing this product with us. And it shows an administrative view and a user view. And if you see in the user view of the mobile interface, it has the higher grouping or the parent codes for primary impression. Once that's selected, the view then offers values from a defined list. So it's one way that that has been implemented, that 3.5 requirement has been implemented in the field. Maintenance process, we recognized early on that this had to continue to be modified as the industry changes. We've established a review board. We're looking at the frequency, how often the codes need to be updated. An automation process has been developed that gives us the ability to update the list and then export it in formats that are usable to the software vendors. And then education and support materials. We can't do this in a vacuum, and we truly rely on input and input and feedback to create meaningful lists and that right education to be able to support that implementation and be able to support that good documentation practices. These resources are included in your list of resources. They'll also be included in the PowerPoint. So we've developed quite a bit of support material, and we are happy to continue to develop support material as you identify those needs in your areas and for your agencies. It's hard for me to see chat and present, so I can just see the chat number growing. So let's go through a couple of those questions. And then, of course, any questions, feedback, input, shoot me an email, send it to the tech, send it to Clay. We are happy to get your feedback and your discussion so that we can make these meaningful and truly usable. All right, let's look at chat. It's also inclusive facility calls. Okay, so Anne Bosbrink asks a really great question. So our defined list really only meant to encompass ICD-10 codes for 911 calls, or is it also inclusive for interfacility calls? Or would each state need to work with their EMS agencies? So the idea for the defined lists, they are built on frequency of all responses, but the vast majority of responses are 911 field calls. So while they are, that's the target type of call, they should be appropriate for interfacility calls, air medical, critical care. Those types should require some tweaking, but not a full revamping. Does that help? And yes, this is a required part of V3 of 3.5 compliance testing for all vendors.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good reason why we don't indicate that this is specific to interfacility, right? The defined list, we require that they be put in, right? So medications, for example, are specific to those used primarily in the pre-hospital setting. If we included like critical care or interfacility transports where patients can be on all kinds of medications, even medication cocktails, right? How could we require that those medications be included in a list, right? So it just, yeah, it's a great question, but yeah, there may be some customization that are needed for interfacility transports. I know we're kind of running out of time, but.
Yeah. Jason, we would love your input on the hierarchy of these lists. As you look through them, when you see something that just doesn't fit for your area, tell us. We really appreciate that feedback. Okay. And then roll-up component is, if it's okay, Amber, we'll come back to the roll-up component. That's more of an internal process at the national level. And we may be able to you may be able to talk Josh into talking about it a little bit. I need to send you guys on break for a minute to stretch your legs, get a drink, refill your coffee cup, take a bio break. But let's meet back here at, let's just do 5 minutes, and then I think we'll be 1:35. Will that put us back on time? Yeah, let's do 5 minutes. So let's meet back here at 11:05. Chris is going to entertain us with another break, slides for break, but then we'll be back at 11:05 and keep going. Thanks, everyone. Josh, would you be, I know I'm just totally throwing you out there, Josh. You are so flexible with us. Would you be willing to address really quick Amber's question on the roll-up component?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
I'll put this in the chat for everyone. So for the, Julianne talked about the defined lists and getting a smaller set of codes that EMS clinicians would see and providing them within kind of a hierarchy of categories for data entry side. For the data research, analysis, analytical reporting side, there's also a resource available through the NEMSIS TAC. So the idea on that side is, okay, let's just go with the fact that you do have thousands of codes coming into your system. And then as a researcher, you want to somehow summarize those thousands of codes into some categories or, you know, get it a little more readable for the research side of things. So there's a document for that. It is also on the technical resources menu, and then you go to the resources page. Same place where you'll find all the defined lists. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see a document. The last link on the page is a document called External Standards Maintenance. And you can check out that one. Again, that's for the research analytical reporting side of things, just assuming you've already got a pile of data and you need to do something useful with it. I'm going to speak with you about updating your validation rules for NEMSIS 3.5, kind of some of the things you're going to need to work on and be aware of. And there's definitely going to be some homework in this area. As you transition to 3.5, you're going to have to touch maybe half or more of the validation rules that you've implemented in your state to make some technical tweaks to them. So this is one area where work will definitely be needed. So the base idea here is when a NEMSIS document is generated, it's generated in a particular version of NEMSIS. For example, 3.4. And so it gets validated using the validation requirements of that specific version. So it goes through version 3.4 XSD validation. It goes through the version 3.4 national schematron validation. And it goes through the version 3.4 state schematron validation for the state in which the agency is operating. So if an agency wants to send you data in version 3.5, it means it needs to be validated using those same three resources, but all in version 3.5 format. So it's going to use the version 3.5 XSD, the 3.5 national schematron, and a 3.5 state schematron. This means a couple things. One is in your state system will need to deploy the 3.5 XSD. They'll need to deploy the 3.5 national schematron. That's easy enough. Those resources already exist, and your vendor will be tested on their deployment of those resources in compliance testing. They'll also be tested on their ability to deploy a state schematron schema in 3.5, but you need to provide that version 3.5 state schematron schema. So in other words, as long as you're accepting data in multiple versions of NEMSIS, you're going to provide schematron schemas in each of those versions of NEMSIS. So for some time, it means you may be providing both your 3.4 rules and your 3.5 rules and keeping both of those updated as you're going along until you stop accepting 3.4. So let's walk through how these changes might look in your schematron rules and then apply that to your state level. So first, let's look at an example here of a rule that is in the national schematron schemas, and it does not change between 3.4 and 3.5. This particular rule says that the unit back in service date time should not be earlier than the unit notified by dispatch date time. It looks at elements in the eTimes section, and it checks to make sure that eTimes.13 is the same or later than eTimes.03. In NEMSIS 3.5, neither of those data elements had any changes to them. So in the national schematron rules for 3.5, the rule is written exactly the same way as it was in 3.4. No changes were needed. Next, let's look at a national rule that we had to change. This rule said age should be recorded when incident patient disposition begins with the word patient. And what we did in the 3.4 rules is we looked for all the different values in eDisposition.12 that indicated that there was a patient. And if the call had one of those dispositions, then we tested to make sure that ePatient.15 was not blank. Well, in 3.5, we have to change this because eDisposition.12 is retired from the standard and no longer available. ePatient.15, on the other hand, had no changes, so we're good on that side of it. But we had to look at it and say, okay, well, instead of looking for incident patient disposition having a value that starts with the word patient, we're going to need to decide which of those new 3.5 disposition elements we're going to use to enforce the same intent here. And so what we went with was that age should be recorded when patient evaluation / care is patient evaluated and care provided. So the code for that rule changes. It now has eDisposition.incident disposition group / eDisposition.28. Nice thing is, though, that we only have to look for one value in that element instead of this whole collection of values that we had to cover in 3.4 with eDisposition.12. So that's an example of a national rule that was changed for 3.5 that's really implementing the same intent, but it has to be coded a little differently. Okay, now let's look at a state rule. This is an actual existing state rule from a state that has been published in their version 3.4 schematron schema. And it says, the message that it gives is pulse oximetry not documented. I've taken a simplified version of the, was there a comment? Okay, I've taken a simplified version of the code for that validation rule. It looks at patient care reports where eDisposition.12, it looks at eDisposition.12 and it looks for 4 different values there. If it has one of those values, then it checks to make sure that eVitals.12 is not blank, so that pulse oximetry is documented. I'm going to quickly bring up the data dictionary for 3.4. So the values they're looking for here are 27, 29, 31, and 33. So they're looking for these ones, patient treated and either released or transferred care or transported by this EMS unit. Those are the calls where they're wanting to enforce this particular rule. So with that in mind, what I want to do now is try to rewrite the rule for 3.5. So first, let's figure out what we want it to say. So the way they had their rule written here was pulse oximetry not documented. They could just go ahead and say the same thing in 3.5, pulse oximetry not documented. But I do want to take an opportunity here to maybe improve the language of this rule, the message a little bit. So the problem I see with this particular message is that it doesn't tell me why that rule triggered or how I would, what was the situation that caused this rule. So go ahead and unmute or put in the chat if you were to rewrite the message of this rule to not just say pulse oximetry not documented, but maybe we want to rewrite it to tell people when the pulse ox should be documented. What would be our intent here? How would we kind of rewrite the message of this rule? What do you think? Okay, one from Dan was if vital signs are not null, then pulse ox should be documented. So that would say essentially that every set of vital signs, if there was a set of vital signs, then pulse ox should be documented. So that's one way to go, but that would require a pulse ox on every set. And then Dan and Anne mentioned pulse ox should be documented when, well, when a patient was treated. Yeah, so let's say that we're going to go with that route, that pulse ox should be documented when a patient is treated, okay? So let's go to the 3.5 data dictionary and figure out how are we going to identify that a patient was treated? Well, I'm looking at patient evaluation and care. And I see one here, patient evaluated and care provided. So that's one we could use. We could say when patient evaluation and care is patient evaluated and care provided. So let's go back to our, the one that we're working on here. Oops. Let's make that less ugly. Something like this, okay? So it's a little more descriptive. You know, they go, oh, that's why that one got triggered. It's because I evaluated and cared for a patient, but I didn't record a pulse ox. Now, then we would need to rewrite the context of this rule, rewrite the schematron code. And so what we're going to be looking for in this case, let me kind of get it started here. We can still look for a patient care report, you know, looking in the eDisposition section, but we're not looking for eDisposition.12 anymore. If I go to the data dictionary, I see that we're looking for eDisposition.28, which is inside of this eDisposition.incident disposition group. So we would actually kind of put in the path to that element. Now this may get, you know, more into the technical weeds than you're going to get as the data manager, but I want to just show you how the differences appear here. Okay, eDisposition.28 is equal to, and then we would go grab that code for patient evaluated and care provided 4228001. And so that gives us our new code. Now, evitals.12 did not change between the two versions of NEMSIS, so we can still leave that part of the code the same, but we had to change the first part because we're using a different data element for the comparison. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. David Newton said, I agree with making the message be very descriptive, but some vendors do not show the message to the medic completing the ePCR. This should be required as part of compliance testing. Yeah, that is required as part of compliance testing. It's something that has been beefed up over the years because of that very issue where vendors were not actually showing the message that you had written to the providers. Okay, I'll pause there for a sec. Any questions on this approach that we're looking at for evaluating and rewriting your rules to work in 3.5? Okay, so here's your to-do list. 1, review every validation rule in your state schematron rule set and determine whether it needs to be modified for 3.5. So if any of the data elements that rule looks at have changed in 3.5, then it potentially needs to be rewritten a little bit. Also, determine any new rules that you might need to add for version 3.5. 3.5 adds some new data elements. And if your state adopts those elements, you might have some brand new rules that you're going to write related to those new elements that you'll be collecting. So once you've done steps 1 and 2, you've got kind of your marching orders for what you need to work on. And so for each rule that needs to be modified or added, I really recommend writing the plain language message first. Okay, so in other words, this message here that the providers see, go ahead and get that written for 3.5. Like, what is it that you're trying to enforce here? And once you've written that plain language message, then you can create or work with your vendor or contractor to create the new schematron code that will enforce that particular rule. Once you've got all your rules written, you'll want to publish your 3.5 rules via your NEMSIS state repository. I want to show you how things are going to show up in your state repository. This will be for schematron. It'll also be for other resources that you publish in 3.5, so I think it'll be helpful to see. Here's the page, the state page for the state of Iowa. And the implementation tools section has several of these standardized resources. You're familiar with these. Iowa actually provides resources for different versions of NEMSIS, and there's a little drop-down menu here that allows me to switch between the 2 versions. You'll see, for example, that their schematron rules for version 3.4.0 were last updated on the beginning of June. I can look at their resources for 3.3.4, the older version. And as I switch there, I'll see that schematron file was last updated about 4 years ago. So as you add your resources for 3.5, then 3.5 is going to show up on this drop-down list. And vendors and agencies will be able to select the resources for that particular version. That's all because we're publishing these in what are called different branches of your state Git repository. This is the actual product that NEMSIS uses to manage your state repositories. This is the repository for Iowa, where we'll see a couple of folders they have with files in them. And there's the concept of branches. I'm on the master branch, and you'll see these 2 release branches. So when you add your first resource for 3.5, there will be a new branch created that will be release 3.5.0. And you can actually tell the NEMSIS TAC when you would like the master branch to point to 3.5 instead of pointing to 3.4. The master branch indicates this is what the state is currently collecting today. So you could actually publish your 3.5 resources, go through a few drafts, and then at some point say, okay, let's have master point to release 3.5.0. We're ready to roll. We're ready for production. So that's what it's going to look like in your state repository. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a few resources, and these resource links are in the resource document that was sent out attached to the Bootcamp calendar attachment. Of course, the NEMSIS data dictionaries pages, your #1 friend there on the NEMSIS website. There's a few other things. The schematron guide, that gets pretty technical, but your vendor especially is going to need that. There are a few technical differences between 3.4 and 3.5 in terms of the schematron rule, the schematron schema files. There's also the schematron development kit. It has technical resources for developers. There's also a test suite framework. So someone can build a bunch of test cases and verify that all of the rules actually result in success or failure as expected. Next, there's a schematron checker. This is a little utility that NEMSIS uses. They use it internally. Anytime you submit a schematron file, the NEMSIS TAC checks to make sure that the schematron file itself is valid. But this tool is also accessible to all of you, and I'm going to show it to you. Here it is. It's real simple. I can choose a schematron file that I'm working on. I've taken the one for Connecticut for their patient care report data and hit validate. And this is going to just check first that the schematron file itself is valid. So it's well-formed XML. It passes what's called RelaxNG validation for schematron files. It passes the ISO schematron validation for schematron files. And finally, some NEMSIS specific requirements for schematron files. So they're good to go on their file, and their file can be published in their repository. There is an additional step here that's done. It's called the state schematron checker, and it creates a report that just helps to identify if there's any potential redundancies or conflicts between this state schematron schema and the national requirements. I'll bring up that report. It has two sections. One is if the state schematron schema has any rules about mandatory elements, it'll list those here, and it will suggest that these rules might be unneeded. And in fact, this first one here is unneeded. They have a schematron rule that says type of service requested is a mandatory field. The NEMSIS XSD already makes that mandatory. So this schematron rule would never get triggered because the document would fail XSD validation first. They would never get to this step of validation. So that's one that they might keep it in their state system for data entry users, but they don't need it in their schematron file. Then there's a section about rules that are similar to national schematron rules. I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom of this section and show an example here. They have a rule that says procedure is a required field on all procedure grid records. So in other words, anytime you report a procedure, you need to tell us what the name of the procedure was. Well, there's a NEMSIS national rule that also says the same thing. So in this case, the end user gets 2 warnings, and the 2 warnings are about the same issue. So that's another one where Connecticut could leave it in their data entry system. It should be there, but they don't need to put it in their schematron rules because there's already a national schematron rule that enforces that same thing. So that's how you can use the state schematron checker. And finally, the translation resources are really helpful. The translation resources, there's a couple of Word documents or PDFs, Word documents, I think, that detail every little change that it would take to translate a document from 3.4 to 3.5 or from 3.5 to 3.4. And so you can see every little change that would be required to get from one version to the other. And that'll help you identify where all those changes happen. And the last 2 links you'll have in the document that was sent was a couple of fairly recent webinars that address schematron. One on writing efficient business rules, that was last March. May have forgotten that because of COVID, but it's there. And one back in 2018 about state level data validation using schematron. So feel free to look at those. All right, I'm going to answer one question from Ridgely, which was, will the word element be replaced with the element name? In the schematron checker, just due to some limitations in how it works, it just has the word element in parentheses there. What people actually see is procedure. And we'll see that, for example, in the data dictionary. If I go to procedures, here's the validation rule that actually, the way it actually shows up. So a little bit of a limitation just in the checker tool, but what people see is the way it is here. Okay, I'm right about at my time, but probably have about a minute for questions. Okay, well, no questions at the moment. So yeah, I just gave you a big piece of homework. Go revisit every single one of your validation rules. Have fun.
So next on our agenda, I'm gonna turn it over to Monet for a few minutes, and she's gonna introduce our next presenter. Monet, you ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great. Thanks, Monet.
Fantastic. Welcome back, everyone. Well, for many of you, this gentleman is a familiar name and a familiar face, but I would like to introduce to some of you and present to others Mr. Chip Cooper. Chip is certainly one of the seasoned data managers, state data managers. He is from the state of New Hampshire, and we consider him a great friend at the NEMSIS Tech. You heard from him earlier, but the thing I want to tell you about Chip is I had an opportunity to review some of the documentation that Chip put together as it relates to the transition from version 2 to version 3. And this information was extremely detailed, line by line, of the actions that he took in his state. And so I thought it was extremely valuable for you to hear from Chip, as he has now put together a document that can be used as a checklist from version 3.4 to 3.5. And so without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to our good friend, Mr. Chip Cooper. And we're extremely grateful that you accepted our invitation to present today. Take it away, Chip.
Thanks, Monet. I appreciate the very generous offer to share with us. We'll see if I can successfully share my screen. So I'm just going to kind of go through this implementation checklist that I'd come up with previously, and just as a resource for all of you with your planning purposes. So real quick orientation to the planning checklist that I put together and some considerations for your planning. So ultimately, if it's not obvious to you, the transition plan is really about project management, and all of you may have access to different sorts of project management software through your states or systems. I've used a couple of these, but this is like a small fraction of the options out there. So sometimes it's helpful to put these projects in, track them through that, or you can simply just use an Excel table ultimately. So so I'll open up the planning checklist in a minute, but this is basically what the headers look like. And my recommendation is you start with this checklist as just a starting point, go through and figure out what's relevant to your state, add or delete items as apply to your state, because there's some things on there that don't apply to New Hampshire, but I'm sure they apply to Nebraska or somewhere else like that. Maybe make an initial prioritization of those tasks to figure out what seems most important. And then at that point, you go into the fluid process of sort of planning and project management in a cycle. You look for more specific tasks with those particular items, estimate the time to complete. You start breaking things down to write a letter to the commissioner or something like that, start working out the timeline, and then you'll end up reprioritizing your tasks as you go along. It's sort of like I don't know, I always find it's a gradual process of thinking of new things and finishing other things, or finding out that you were putting a lot of time into something that maybe isn't as relevant for you. So, and I'll see if I find the right one. Okay. So this is, if it's not already in the resources, it will be. Pretty much overall, this is what I was kind of walking through here. First step I recommend is looking through, really comparing 3.4 to 3.5 as a gap analysis. And Monet has provided some great resources for that to look farther into your details. But it's really hard to figure out what you're going to need for validation rules and changing your run forms and printouts and everything else without having a real good, clear sense of what it is you're doing. And let's see if I find the right one. All right, so this is one that I was working on initially, and then I've actually been updating with Monet's resource that she just put out today. But as an example, and I'm happy to share this, I'm identifying the changes in here, but what I really did was I lined up 3.5 with 3.4, and get all the information there, kind of the changes, and actually even lined up the state elements. So you can kind of see where those march across the whole line with 3.5, 3.4, and the state elements that are now lining up with the 3.5 and kind of replacing those, and just going through and deciding what's there, what's not, and all the changes, so I have a pretty good sense of where adjustments need to be made. And that really becomes my gap analysis. at that point, going back to my checklist, I'm going to work through those things. Decide if I have custom elements that I still need or need to add. So for instance, New Hampshire's using a few custom elements our vendor has made that now are real elements. So I won't need to use the old custom elements. I'll transition right over to the elements that have replaced those. So really kind of identify those things. Look at the existing fields, what you might need in there, and go from there. Again, custom elements that you may want, custom values may need with any changes or additions if they aren't thorough enough for you. And then really go back through and look at your defined lists. I haven't really done that in New Hampshire yet, but we'll definitely be doing that in 3.5 that Julianne talked about earlier. And at that point, you may be able to look at some value lists for your vendors, be able to produce those for your vendors to update their materials, including your agency's facilities, which isn't really relevant to 3.5, but you're going to want that as a resource when you update those things. Look at approval requirements. Some of you have different bodies that might need to approve your data sets, your advisory councils, some sort of state approving body, all the way up to your legislative folks need to approve what's going to be in your system. So start working through that. And then when you're ready to publish your data set. So for me, a data set is basically the Excel table looking at all the criteria we just looked at in the gap analysis. And it's really all the criteria for it, but it's not really a dictionary with the extra comments that you would see with NEMSIS. Now, Monet also, I think, alluded to this earlier. Software vendors are supposed to be able to take your setup, push it to NEMSIS so that it can build the nice data set that they have. That previously we've been taking all these lists, we go and we build them, we modify that stuff, and then click the button and it produces that to the data set builder on NEMSIS. Software vendors will be doing that to help us out with that. So one key point, if I didn't, I can't remember if I put it down farther, but you will want to be thinking about also updating your 3.5 demographic data set for the demographic files going up. But I think I mentioned that later. Josh just gave us a great presentation on validations or port of entry rules, kind of do a comparison of that. Again, I've done that for my system where I'm kind of, actually, I have an Excel sheet that I track our current validation rules. And I just put them together and I get the messages. One thing I've kind of learned working with our vendors is I have to put, our system assigns a rule number. So I'm actually putting the rule number in there, the points and the value or the data element, because they'll get calls and they'll say, well, I'm getting this message. I'm not really quite sure which it applies to. And that's helpful for me to go back and backtrack and find out where the issue actually is. If anyone, like we're an image trend state, so if I have multiple image trend agencies, as soon as you download those rules, the rule number changes in that new agency. So this gives me a nice resource to back up. And then I've just simply expanded this to look at 3.4, 3.5. And if I have to make a change, if I need a new rule or something like that, and if it applies to both. So our vendor particularly has a nice system that I can define whether it's a 3.4, 3.5, or both. Your vendors may have something else depending on who they are, but this is a tool I'm happy to share. I find it a great resource to just slowly work through all of your validation rules, as Josh said, and it's a little easier than looking at it in the actual tool itself. Oh, not the right one. And so there's basically your scheme, and from there you're going to build your schematron. If you have a state schematron, some states do, some states don't, and you're going to want to update those working with your vendor so that those can reflect your new rules. That's going to get uploaded. That's going to be a separate file if it's not self-evident. And you want to share that with NEMSIS schematron library so that services can go in and pull that down, or vendors can go pull that down. Think about legal updates, data use agreements with NEMSIS. Actually occurred to me this morning, I don't know if those expand to sharing data with National Trauma Database because of the UUID, but certainly all those are going to need to be updated. And if your legal departments or anything like mine, I need a lot of lead time. I might be able to have those updated in a couple of years the way they're going right now. Some of you may need to consider updating your software contracts. If you didn't include version updates in there, any data access policies for any outside parties, things like that. So these are just considerations. Look through and figure out what really applies to you. And once all that's together, now you can really look at a data dictionary. Some of you may produce a separate one. Some of you may just use the NEMSIS option. Some of you may not use an option at all. I've got one that we put out that was a copy of the NEMSIS variation, but we expanded on it. It's a little labor intensive to keep up. And I'm happy to share this template too. But I just put in some more specific things like whether it's New Hampshire uses versus national. And also clarification as much for myself as for anyone is the recurrent is always confusing to me. If I looked at the national dictionary, you'll get sometimes it refers to the recurrence in the record. Sometimes it talks to the recurrence of values. And so we've actually broken that out. So hopefully it's fairly clear to our folks and include all the other same stuff that you're going to see in the NEMSIS data dictionary. But this is our control. We can kind of add things in there and additional comments that we have specifically at the state level. So that's something I might go through kind of a little later down the road after we're done with that. So those are your rules. And now you're going to get into actually your system configurations, setting up your data element managers, whatever those might be in your systems. Consider any changes to your run form that are going to need to be there. Obviously, Disposition 12 is going to be a big change. But we did do some testing on that early on, and well, it's a couple more clicks. We found it actually to be a little quicker and easier for providers to figure out what it is, you wanted to put in and see what their options are. They didn't have to read a list of however many and sort through what they needed a little bit quicker. Build in your validation rules and work out any integrations that you might need to do with any systems that you have. So some of you may have state software. I know Texas, I think you guys build your own. And hopefully your programmers have been working on this for a while, because I know it's a bit of a lift to change this stuff out. So work with your vendors and see what's going on there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, prepare to upload your 3.5 demographic files. They actually go in a different place. And as Monet talked about, there's demographic fields that now aren't there anymore, but then there's some other replacements for that you'll want to account for with your services. Hospital linkages, we're going to talk to all your hospitals, figure out what you need to talk to if you need to do education with them, HIE systems. If you have any patient registries that are tied in, look at the linkages there. We've already identified there's a big difference with the trauma registries. CARES has got a lot of changes to make that a little bit easier, maybe put more of the work on the CARES folks than on us. And there may be other changes in the various registries that you really need to talk to the registrars about, whatever your linkages might be. I know it's different regionally and statewide. And so lots of variations there just to really think about. I know in our state, we have some services start to use this feature called No2. Some of them just use it for electronic faxing. Some of them use it for, they can actually set up more of an integration with the hospital and get some information back from the hospital, depending on what the hospitals and services are willing to do and pay for. And then put all this stuff together and start figuring out your transition timeline. You're going to need to talk to your software vendors to see when they're ready for NEMSIS approval. The website is updated very frequently as to who's approved and who's in the process of being compliance tested. So that's always a big factor. It's great. Our software vendors are rolling out tools, but they are not compliance tested yet, which is fine because I'm not ready to do anything with them. Figure out your training needs, training material, how long you're going to need to configure the system. Piloting software, I always recommend piloting. Fortunately, I've piloted in the past when I thought I was good to go with version 3, and thank God I did, because we had so many problems that we didn't anticipate, and we thought we were good to go. And it was well worth doing some piloting before we turned things on for the entire state. And I had to move, go into WITSEC. Some of this lead time is going to be affected by your third-party software vendors too. So it's not only your software vendor, but it's going to be, if you have third-party folks, you need to really be thinking about that and finding out what their timeline is, because it's great. We may be able to say, all right, January 1st, we're 3.5, but if software vendors aren't even going to be ready by then it's awful hard to mandate some of that if the agencies can't do anything about it. Talk about your service communications, work through with those folks, whatever you use for communications, emails, letters, pamphlets, stakeholder groups, any of those sorts of things. Have your service leaders talk to their billing software, make sure are they prepared to accept runs through version 3.5. And originally asked me, how many people do I have helping you? I finally have one person helping me. So I mostly did most of the stuff on my own and the first time around, but now I have one person helping me. And so this is why lead time and planning is really pretty important. And another good point is your data query systems. So you probably have to rebuild some of your reports because of the changes in Disposition 12 or other fields to search. Sometimes it's going to actually be easier based on the new values than it might be with the Disposition 12. And then, of course, your communications with your third-party vendors, working through with them. So I think that was all the resources I wanted to share with you guys. Looks like it. And then considerations, we talked about this, working with your software vendor, evaluating the tools they provide. So our vendor is already providing some tools. I'm trying to wrap my brain around those tools and how they're going to affect our plan for transition. And then working with your third-party vendors in terms of your plans for shutting off data sets and moving through those systems. So if anyone have questions, I think I'm a little ahead of time, but I wanted to make sure I got it all in so we stayed on track. I see a bunch of chats, but I wasn't reading those. So,
yeah, Chip, this is Clay. Ridgely asks if these documents could be made available.
Absolutely. Yeah, some of them I've already sent to the NEMSIS folks, and I don't know if you guys have posted them up, but I'll resend them to them and they can post those up, and feel free to borrow, steal from them liberally. I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel if I can help it, and modify as you want.
Wow, Chip, that's really great of you. There's clearly hours and hours put into that, so thank you. You mentioned you're kind of working on that really cool document that compares the actual elements within each of the data sets. That kind of looks like something that you're working on. Could that be made available as well? That looked really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I originally built it with some outdated information that Monet straightened me out on, and I'm actually stealing liberally from her work that she published today to try and go through and finish updating this for myself. And I'm totally happy to share this with people. It's helping me out a lot. And again, once I go through and check, I may pass it off to Monet, and she can maybe double check me, and we can share that out with anyone that wants to use it.
Okay, Chip, and Anne in Arizona asks a really cool question. Do you provide a version of this to your agencies for them to have a checklist for transition?
I haven't necessarily in the past. I think I did some with version 3 originally because it was such a radical change. I think it's going to be a much smaller change, but really that, in my mind, goes into the education materials, which I haven't built yet. We're also, just to really complicate things, we're on the process of rolling out the fire reporting system, which in our state is integrated with the EMS system. So we've got that going on concurrently with the version 3.5 planning and transition there. So should be fairly interesting trying to communicate all those changes all at once to our services. But I don't have any I haven't yet built shorter documents to communicate this with our services, but that's certainly on our education materials for those services to build. So sorry, I don't have those to share yet. All right, well, thanks everyone. I think, I don't know what's up next. Sounds like we might be ready for a break there, Julianne.
Go ahead, Monet.
I just wanted to say, Chip, there's so many comments in the chat about people just thanking you for this documentation. And I am just extremely grateful that you accepted our invitation to share the information. Thank you for all your hard work and efforts on this. We greatly appreciate you. And I just wanted to see if it's time for us. Yes, we can take a 5-minute break. And when we return, we'll hear from our next presenter, which will be Lauri Bradt.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome back. I'm going to jump into our next session here. I want to say thank you first for you guys hanging in there with us. I know it's been a long morning, but we're in the final home stretch. So thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to touch on my first presentation. My name is Lauri Bradt. By the way, I've been with NEMSIS since about December, so I'm rather new to the team, but excited to be here today. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is market availability. And I know we've gotten some questions from you all as well as from vendors as far as the timing of this transition and when will vendors want to know when will states be ready to transition. States want to know when will vendors have passed compliance and be ready to make that change. So we have tried to gather that information from both of you and make it available to help you in this transition. So just briefly, I'm going to touch on kind of bigger picture of the version 3.5 timeline, history, and looking ahead in that. And then also vendor transition intentions as they have shared with us what they're hoping timeframes that they are shooting for. And then also vendor compliance and where you can find those last 2 items on our website as well. This may look familiar to you, hopefully. It's something we have shared in the past, and it is essentially a versioning schedule. You can see it goes back to 2018 and really 2017, I've heard, is where conversations were started, where we started gathering information and feedback from you all of what changes would be helpful and how to implement those. And then we entered some candidate release time, some testing, and we finally are at a place now where we are ready to start accepting 3.5 data. And as far as timelines, moving forward as well, I know some people have asked how long can we continue to submit 3.4, and our plan for that is that in the next 18 months, essentially, by the end of January 2023 is when we will no longer be accepting 3.4 data. So if you can keep that in mind as you're making that transition. And then there's a few states still submitting 3.3.4, and that will no longer be accepted by the end of next month, by the end of August. So if you're in that camp, if you can make that transition as soon as possible as well. And let's see, the next one here, it shows just the lifespan of our last 2 versions. And this blue bar on the top, version 3.3, lasted for 7 years. So we do not make these changes flippantly. We are really intentional about what we're doing and the changes and improvements that we want to bring. Version 3.4 actually lasted even longer, for 8 years. And we do want to mention, however, that moving forward, we hope to be able to make changes more rapidly as we've recognized the changing market and industry standards and demands are coming more quickly than they used to. And so we do anticipate being able to update and make changes beyond 3.5 sooner than 7 or 8 years, like you've seen in the past. And my next slide shows vendor availability. And there also is a section on our website. I can show you where this is found. We have asked vendors when they will be ready for you to transition to this. And this is what they have told us. If you can see your vendor there, I'm not sure if it's big enough on your screen, but essentially 80% of the vendors said in the next 6 months, by the end of 2021 is when they will have it available and have passed compliance and be ready to make that transition. And the remaining 20% of vendors said by the end of 2022. So they are, they're making strides in that direction and moving that way. And we're excited for that. And let me show you real quickly what that looks like. If you are on our website, you can find this page, or someone may be posting it in a link right now, but they, oh, I'm on the wrong tab here, I think. Nope, I'm ahead of myself. Hang on one second. I'm gonna slide ahead. Vendor compliance, I wanted to show you an example of. And on our website, you will see this here. And one thing I wanted to point out is that it auto resets to version 3.4. So if you go to this little drop down caret here and choose 3.5 and scroll down, you'll be able to see, find your vendor and see where they are in the process, if they have completed or when they started the process, or if they, on the bottom, if they are in the process of seeking compliance. So that will be helpful for you to find that information there. And that is, let me move this one out of the way now. Second thing I wanted to touch on was that on this, on our website as well, there's a state transition page that tells when states are planning to transition. And this is based on surveys we sent out to you all. And it's posted in a couple places. It's posted on your state page, and that's so that agencies in your state can look and know what your plans are. And so we encourage you to check there. And if that information is not correct, please let Monet or myself know, and we can update that for you. And then it also is posted here. If you go to using EMS data under the version 3.5 revision tab, it shows state and vendor transition plans. And that looks like, if you click on the red button on the top there, it looks like this, an Excel sheet. And there's two different tabs. There's one that shows timeframes planned by states, and the second tab shows timeframes of vendor transitions. So hopefully both of those things will help you as you navigate what kind of timing you're looking at. And finally, I want to say thank you for the role that you play. We really appreciate you submitting data that we know takes a lot of time and commitment on your part to make sure it's timely and that it's accurate. And we work with literally hundreds of researchers every year who are requesting this and who are using it to make changes that really lead to improved patient care and saved lives. So we just want to thank you and encourage you that what you are doing matters. And do we have any questions before I pass it off to Ben next? Any questions on transitions?
Lauri, this is Clay. Could you just quickly just start at the beginning of the NEMSIS webpage and kind of show folks how they would access the transition?
Sure.
Excel. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. So under technical, let's see. So the transition under using EMS data is where you'll go, this tab right here. And then if you go to version 3.5 revision, And then this top red tab is where you'll find that state and vendor transition plans.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I also wanted to follow up. Anne had some questions in the chat, but her follow-up question was, what do we know about the vendors that haven't specified when they're going to have a 3.5 product? And I just wanted to respond to that. We've had great response from a lot of the software vendors on what their plans are for developing and launching 3.5 compliant products. But there are some vendors that have not made their intentions known, and we just flat out don't know what their plans are. So we share the responses that we've got from all the vendors that were willing to let us know, and we'll continue to bring it up on 3.5 calls and encourage that conversation as well. I know it's not super helpful, Anne, but I hope that answers your question.
All right, I will stop sharing and pass it off to Ben Fisher, who's going to talk about UUID next.
All right. Thank you. And hopefully this is part presentation, and then we'll field some questions. I know UUID in particular has been a really kind of hot topic, and there have been a lot of questions revolving around it. So hopefully some of this will clarify some of that, and then we'll see what questions you all have and what we can do to help clarify some of this. So I am actually going to start with an example. I think one of the things that has kind of a lot of the focus has been on the trauma registry EMS data linkage. And so I just want to kind of highlight an example unrelated to EMS data. UUIDs are something we interact with every day. They are kind of all around us. But I think they're not something we're kind of aware we interact with, and they're implemented by software vendors at a low level to kind of link data. So in this example, you can see here that right in the URL bar is a UUID that kind of identifies from a streaming service the session, the user, and the show you're watching. But you would never pick WandaVision by typing a UUID into the URL. You would never click in your address bar and enter this 36-character string. You would use a graphical user interface to select your, show and then what you want to watch. So similarly, UUID is designed as a technical behind-the-scenes way to link and identify records, but you're still going to use your graphical user interface for whatever software you're using and other identifiers to identify records. But sort of like in Clay's very first presentation, you can see the limitations when we were using a hash of smushed together elements that could potentially change. If those elements change, all of a sudden we can't identify those records using what we had been. But the hope is that this simplifies that process, but it's not something you're going to interact with on a day-to-day basis. There may be edge cases where you need to use something to identify a linkage problem or a submission problem. But for the most part, this is going to occur at the vendor and software level. It's going to be generated in the vendor software and then travel with that record depending on what the UUID is identifying, whether it's record or agency or vehicle, something like that. But again, it's not something that you're going to be entering in. And it's also designed to be very forward-facing. So obviously with the 3.5 implementation, these will start following the new records in the new format. I posted links, and they're also in the resources tab as well, for the 3.5 UUID guide, a ACS white paper that is specific to the trauma registry linkage concept, and then a vendor UUID technical resource guide. So that top document, the 3.5 UUID guide, goes over the actual what the UUID is and why we're implementing it. And then the vendor UUID technical resource guide is geared a little bit more towards the software vendors to provide a technical understanding of how and why they would be actually implemented. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and we'll take some questions about UUID. I know there are quite a few, and I've asked Josh to kind of stay with us for a little bit to answer any if anybody wants to get really into the weeds. I think my hope is some of this will kind of relax everyone's fears a little bit about what they need to do to prepare for UUID. This is something that's going to be collected, in the data, but it's going to be really, again, you'll hear me say this a lot. It's going to be behind the scenes. It's something that, again, you interact with this in software implementations every day, and we're just kind of unaware of it. So with that, I will stop talking, and we're happy to answer questions. Or I think if everyone's sick of hearing about UUID, we can also, you can throw virtual tomatoes using the reaction emoji widget. Any questions or comments? Nothing. I've resolved everyone's concerns and questions about UUID. We're done, and we'll never have to talk about it again. Perfect.
This is Josh. I guess while people are thinking of questions, I'll mention that most of the UUIDs in NEMSIS 3.5 are in the demographic data. The patient care report data just has one UUID, and that's the one that identifies the patient care report. The reason for adding UUIDs to all those things in demographics was, many of you are actually not accepting demographic data submissions from your agencies that are using third-party products. And the reason you're not submitting those submissions is because they're creating lots of duplicate records in your state system when you receive them. The UUID is intended to address that problem so that you can begin accepting demographic data from your agencies in the NEMSIS DEM dataset format and not have it result in a bunch of duplicate personnel, duplicate vehicles, duplicate locations, et cetera. So a lot of it's on that side. And again, very much under the hood, these are just attributes that are attached to each object in the file. But there is the one on the patient care report so that we can also avoid having duplicate patient care reports as agencies submit updates. And then Dan asked, is a UUID similar to a GUID? Yes, they're exactly the same thing, universal versus global. They're just two different names that different companies came up with. Same exact thing.
Yes. Peter asked if I can solve all of the technical challenges with the data linkage. No, that's actually Josh's job, so he's gonna fix all that.
UUID solves everything.
Yep. All right. Well, yeah, please feel free to post more questions in the chat, and then my email is also available. But I think that puts us a minute or two ahead of schedule, and I will turn things back over to Lauri to talk about educational and support materials.
All right, our next session is one where we really want to hear from you. We're going to want some interaction here. We're going to utilize Poll Everywhere again. And we want some feedback from you specifically around the topic of educational support materials. We are hearing that you would like us to provide some more resources. And so we would like to know some questions we will ask is what types of materials do you feel are necessary to help you in this transition? Who is your target audience? Are you wanting materials more for clinicians in the field or for agency training or for your peers, whoever it may be? So those are some of the questions we're looking for, as well as what mode of learning is best for you. Is it short videos or longer training videos or continuing education credits? And we are in the process of putting together a committee to help do this. If anyone is really interested, reach out to myself or Julianne, and we'd love to have you be more involved in this process even. And so if you can pull out your phone or an internet browser and enter in this information, just like you did during Atim's presentation, if you can enter, it's pollev, POLLEV.com/LAURI BRADT and 384. Or if you're on your phone, you can also text that as well. And if you want to show me once you're connected, maybe give me an emoji or a hand raised or smiley face or something, I can see who's ready to go.
Hi, Laura. I put in the address and it shows the previous poll.
Yes, I think that's going to change as soon as I go to the next screen.
Okay.
If all goes well here. All right, so everyone entered in. Okay, hopefully your poll just transitioned to this question. In one word, tell us how you are feeling about the version 3.5 transition. We're feeling great, good, validity, overwhelmed, anxiety, nervous. Overwhelmed is really big. That means a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed, as well as excited. Busy, optimistic, that's a good word. Kind of uncertain. All right, well, hopefully this is helping you recognize, sometimes it's good to just recognize how you're feeling and recognize that you are not alone, that there's likely others who are feeling similar to you, feeling how you are. And we want you to know that if you are feeling overwhelmed or anxiety, we are here to help you and support you in this, and that you are not alone. There's others who are walking the same road with you. And we want to provide support and educational resources to help you in this transition. So excited for the possibilities, someone said too. I like that. Stepping in the right direction. That's great. Optimistic. Okay. Thank you for that. Let me move on to the next question. And this is kind of helping us as we create these materials know who is it that you most need resources for. Is it clinicians, agencies, resources for state representatives? Where should we focus our time and resources the most? And this is a live poll. I should have said in the beginning too, in the short answer ones, please keep your answers PG. We will see what you're writing, so keep that in mind. And this will adjust as people submit. So it looks like the majority, 64% currently, are looking for resources for agencies. So that's really helpful for us to know as we create these. All right, great. I'm going to move on to the next one. And this is just talking about what type of training is most useful for you. Do you feel that short videos that you can send out, little 2 to 5 minute videos, are the most helpful on a specific topic, or longer training videos? Are you most interested, or maybe are clinicians most interested in something that is attached to continuing education credits? We do want to provide these free of charge to you. And so we are both producing and sharing them for you to share free. Informational sheets, is that most helpful? So what modality of training, what type of training is the most helpful? Are you guys seeing a new question?
Yeah, Lauri, and is this one a tap to answer you want to move? Oh, okay, then submit your response. Can you reorder these?
Yes, I believe so. Is this a, yes, I think this is a ranking question. So you can slide
So you click on it and then allows you to reorder them. I see. Okay.
Or is there an arrow, maybe an up and down arrow
Yeah.
that adjusts it? Okay. Okay, so far it looks like short, specific videos, 2 to 4 minutes is the most desired. Informational sheets is a close second. Continuing education modules is third, and the longer training sessions are the least desired. Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you for that. And the next question has to do with training subject areas. As there's several new parts of version 3.5, we would love to hear from you what specifically of these topics would be most important for us to focus on in these training things that we provide. Is it helpful to give the history, like we did a little bit today, of what has changed and why? Or eDisposition 12 being a big difference? Would it be helpful to focus on that? eOutcomes, defined lists, and again, your ranking, I believe. So you're using an up and down arrow to determine to you which is the most important. Okay, eDisposition 12 is the winner. So that is where we can focus a lot of our efforts. And then defined lists still need some training and clarification, it sounds like. eOutcomes the least. Okay. Thank you for that. And I believe this is the last question. We have a short answer question where we would love to hear from you. If you can think of examples of really great training that you have seen, it may be EMS related or it may not be. If there's something that you can point us to that we could maybe model this training after, or even a vendor or company that you've seen or used, or do you really love training that has live actors and simulates situations? Is that most helpful? So what types of training have you seen? And this should be a pretty short answer. PowerPoint with videos interspaced, good. Live interactive is most helpful, okay. Simulation training that allows participation, or simulations with examples, good. Graphics with arrows or visual examples. On-demand video, examples, lots of examples. Simulation with participation. Simulation with interactive in a test data environment. Josh is training today on validation rules, schematron, updates. He started with square one and built from there. So maybe don't assume any kind of prior knowledge. Let's see, how to speak. Okay, great. This is perfect. This is exactly what we were looking for. Some great specific examples of things we could model ours after. Thank you. If you think of any in the future, feel free to email us to us or reach out. And then I do want to show you briefly this page. Let me slide this over here. And if you go to, again, using EMS data, if you scroll down to NEMSIS 101, you'll find the page I have opened up here. And this is a great resource if you haven't explored it, to check it out, because there are already some additional resources here for use. If you look at under NEMSIS 3.5 is a good category, or state-specific tools, another great section where there's some specific things for you to pass off to agency will help you to explain things that are a priority to them or are changes coming up and to be prepared for that. So I encourage you to reach out there, use that website, and reach out if you have more questions. And then I also wanted to mention that this, as I mentioned earlier, in the works, we are forming a committee of people that may be interested in being process or continuing to give feedback. And it's something that you'd love to be a part of, reach out to myself or Julianne, Monet, any of us, we can get you connected with that. And I also wanted to announce that we have started already. We're in the process of working with which is an EMS training platform. And we are working with them to provide some free access for you to those that will be around these we discussed today and helping with the version 5 transition. And they will qualify for continuing education credit as well. So that thing that we are excited to announce and that we are working on currently. That's all I have. Any feedback from you all as far as education materials, support materials, anything that we didn't ask or cover? Right. Well, if you think of anything, reach out. We'd love to hear that. And we might give you a little extra time today as a parting gift. Let me mention too, you will be an email from me later today with a link to a survey, just feedback on Bootcamp of anything that you enjoyed or that could be done differently. We'd love positive and criticism as well. And we would love to hear in future trainings if there's things that you'd learn that were not covered today, or in our monthly, if there's things that you'd like to, topics you'd like covered. So be looking for that link from me, a general survey for feedback. And I'm going to pass it off to Eric to close us out today.
Yeah, Lauri, we have one quick question from Jay. I think he's asking for a flyer from NEMSIS, maybe through social media or others, that just let providers know that version 3.5 is coming. Am I interpreting that correctly, Jay?
You interpreted absolutely great. What I'd like to do is give heads up that this is coming.
Yeah.
And things that we've talked about, especially you, Clay, and your groups. Hey, this is a fix. This is clarity. I love that word, clarity, in these things together. So I think you're on the right track. I'd like to that we could use to introduce this and put it out. Say, hey, it is coming. Mm-hmm. Thank you for the time.
Idea. Yeah, great idea. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Any other questions or feedback in general or for any of us? All right, I'll pass it off to Eric.
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hear you and see you.
So first and foremost, I can't thank all of you enough for participation and your questions, your input, feedback you provide. Rest assured, all the chats that we review in a meeting, we make sure to address those and they go into our discussions and planning process. I want to just a couple of general statements. This is what I've learned now from NEMSIS, and I'll be talking about in August. In my short tenure as the project manager and see if anybody agrees. First and foremost, everyone wants more data. Second, most want very specific data to meet their specific needs. Third, many want that data to be collected now. We can just turn it on. You have the resources to development or addition of those data elements, and no one wants to pay. All requests mean additional work for you, and more importantly, for the clinician in the field who has to do it for the overall project success. So sort of the list that I look at when I read the different comments and things that come in chat meetings, and as I sit there and look at different special groups about the data that they want you to collect and how you can support theirs. And I keep those in the back of my mind as the conversations go on. I think that Monet and we kind of hit on some key topics. The big things for me forward is how to become more agile. Decrease submission times. We talked about that. We'll be talking more about that in the August meeting. Another part that's really important is a focus on operational data. We built NEMSIS back in the day to focus on the patient, and important. A lot of the focus in ES right now is on the organizational needs, the need to open, the need to have appropriate staffing, the collection billing process, the E3 process. All of that means changing focus, but certainly looking at what we're doing from different lens. I want to focus on redundancy. That was discussed, define list in some way, maybe not redundant, but really is it necessary? And that goes to, the original list I read down, it's one of those where someone wants to collect something specific and Claver is struck by duck and mine bitten by orca. I never heard an EMS provider, oh man, if they only bitten by orca on there, I could have selected it. I want to increase the ability to update things, be agile, and to do all that. I recognize, ladies and gentlemen, it takes resources, and the resources are not at the TAC level, although they have them as well. The resources that I'm talking about focus on getting funding state level for the state data manager to support a program specifically for EMS. Have your time split between offices, as I know that may do. So you're going to hear us ask meetings like this, and hence the one you just participated in, things like, what do you need? What do you need tomorrow, next month, and next year? And I want to focus on something. If you're not been involved with federal government and federal government funding 2 to 3 years down the line instantly, I have basically drafted the NEMSIS 2022 budget. So if you want to see my ball and pick some lottery numbers, please let me know. But that's basically what we're doing, is predicting what you're going to be doing in 2022 so that I can fund it. So the more input I get and the more requests I get, the further down the road you look, even pie in the sky, the helpful that'll be in putting that together. I think another thing that I've learned in this process is that I'm limited by technology. Nothing that we're doing is technologically advanced so that it's impossible. In fact, there's all kinds of great, cool things down the road that we can use. But again, they require resources. They require us to be agile and be able to change this faster. And then, where do those resources come from? That's on us to help support you to make that happen. I want to make very clear that I'm always available to you guys. I get emails from some of the people on this call on a regular basis. Some of them are very blunt, some of them are short. Just say, hey, what are you doing here? Think about it. Or did you think about this before you did that? Or hey, what's this organization doing something? I am more than happy to get those. I love to get them. Love to hear from you. I want to make sure we're doing what you think we're doing. If you think Clay and the TAC are heading crazy direction, I want to know. Please feel free to reach out. To me, and having in a state EMS office, that's the critical link here. As we start to talk about surveillance systems and we start to talk about real time, I don't think that's something at the national level. The national level data standard, as we've done in the past, it's critical that you guys be able to provide data to the requesting agencies or requesting organization, and that data be standardized and that you funded for providing that, not our office, not the TAC, and not other vendors. I really appreciate your time today, and I'd be happy to answer absolutely any questions about NEMSIS you have for me. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Eric or any comments, suggestions from previous presentations?
This is Anne from Arizona. I had a question, and I feel the answer to this. Obviously, Eric, I know that you are overseeing the NEMSIS team and kind of with the NHTSA, but you also, I know you talk sometimes about USFARA, and then I don't know how much you have to do. I know there's I can't remember what they're called now, but they do the EMT registry, the certifications. Does that fall on NHTSA also somehow, or is that in the, because I think a lot about how our databases don't interact with other ones that, unless you buy the same, they don't, when really a lot of it is interrelated, especially when you start talking about opera stuff.
So it's a very good hand. Thank you. We actually had a call this at 9 o'clock with FARS, the reporting system, if you're not familiar, and with MUC, Model Uniform Criteria data sets that are the DOT data sets. Josh has completed very detailed analysis of all three of them, states what MUC would have to change, FAR would have to change, and NEMSIS would change to make them consistent with each other in terms of the data collected and the elements, the definitions, I'm sorry. We also talked about injury severity and how that's reviewed. Currently, those data sets rely on CAPCO as opposed to ES injury data. We talked about whether it's in the best interest to look at injury from law enforcement officers or from us personnel providing care. So that project is ongoing to NHTSA department. Actual NAEMT or NRT, the National Registry of EMT, Bill Seifert now runs that organization. And essentially we have with them as well. We were involved, Clay and myself participated back then in person, National Registry in Ohio when they were out the provider database. And actually National Registry did an incredible thing. They said anywhere we offered, when they were building their database, they already had that data element in NEMSIS, they just adopted that definition. We were there basically to say, hey, we've adopted, if you want to adopt, here's the definition. Also worked out a provider ID number that's signed in the provider database for NREMT. And we coordinated that with the CMS and CMMI folks that are on the ET3 model. They develop this number, how should we set up so that in the future, we don't have to create a second unique ID number for the individual EMS clinician, that they can just keep the same NREMT uses, and we would recognize that technology-wise now. And I don't know the ET3, the CMMI processes as some of these, but that's the plan. So those are examples of how we do coordinate those things. However, I know that data managers get tagged for a lot of support during the transportation grants and so on and so forth that go on at the state level. So if you find areas where we need additional work, please point to me and we'll be happy to address that in our office.
Thank you.
If there are no additional questions out there, that you'll be receiving an email with a link for an evaluation. Please open, honest, frank, what was good, what bad, and what can do better to serve you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for competing and being honest with us, and for taking time out of your day to spend with us this morning. We do have a V3 call tomorrow, and then in just 3 short weeks, we're doing annual. So lots of stuff coming up. Thank everyone for your participation, and thanks for being with us today. Have a good day.